Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open the vault on something deeply American and deeply weird, the 1940s, when the biggest brands you still trust today were quietly doing things they'd really prefer you forget. We're talking about the decade when Coca-Cola cozied up to Nazi Germany, when IBM's punch cards helped organize the Holocaust, when Ford took home Nazi medals, and when your grandma's favourite household names were testing products in ways that would make a horror movie director blush. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Seriously, your idea shaped this entire script and I'm genuinely grateful. These suggestions are what keep the channel growing and the content fresh. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 2 AM somewhere. Oh, and by the way, the channels now live on Spotify too, so if you want to fall asleep to corporate skeletons rattling in closets, the link's in the description. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe hide your credit card so you don't accidentally boycott half your pantry by morning. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what your favourite brands were really up to during World War II? Did Coca-Cola actually sell soda to both sides of the war? What did IBM know about where their machines were being used? Were American car companies really that friendly with the Third Reich? How many household products were tested on people who couldn't say no? Would you still buy that cereal if you knew what the company did to get it on your shelf? And what happens when profit margins matter more than basic human decency? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1945, the war's ending, America's about to boom, and every smiling advertisement you see is covering up secrets that would make your morning coffee taste like guilt. Good luck. Let's start with something refreshing. Or not. Coca-Cola, the all-American beverage, the drink that supposedly embodies freedom, apple pie, and baseball, had a bit of an image problem during World War II. Specifically, the problem was that they were selling soda to Nazi Germany. Yes, that Nazi Germany. When the war made it impossible to import Coca-Cola syrup into occupied Europe, the company's German branch didn't shut down and go home. Instead, they invented an entirely new drink made from leftover apple fibers and whey, marketed it to the Third Reich, and called it Fanta. The drink was a massive hit among Nazis, Hitler Youth rallies, and Wehrmacht soldiers alike. And here's the kicker. After the war, Coca-Cola quietly folded Fanta back into its global empire, rebranded it with cheerful orange flavours, and pretended none of this ever happened. So next time you crack open a Fanta, just remember, you're drinking a beverage born in wartime fascism, now available in tropical twist. The story begins in 1933, when Max Keith took over Coca-Cola's German operations. Keith was ambitious, loyal to the brand, and deeply committed to keeping Coke flowing through German throats no matter what. As the Nazi Party rose to power, Keith didn't flinch. He adapted. He attended Nazi rallies, plastered swastikas on Coca-Cola advertising, and made sure the drink was available at every Reich-sponsored event. Coca-Cola became the official beverage of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, served to athletes and spectators under banners celebrating Aryan supremacy. It was peak branding, Nazi edition. But then the war started, and suddenly importing Coca-Cola syrup from America became impossible. The Atlantic was a war zone, trade routes were cut, and the US and Germany were about to become enemies. Most companies would have shut down. Keith saw an opportunity. If he couldn't sell Coke, he'd invent something new. He gathered his team and told them to create a beverage using only ingredients available in wartime Germany. What they came up with was Fanta, a fizzy drink made from apple pomace, leftover whey from cheese production, and whatever fruit scraps could be scavenged. It tasted vaguely sweet, vaguely fruity, and nothing like Coca-Cola. But it was new, it was German, and it was available. Fanta became a sensation. It was marketed to housewives as a cooking ingredient, to soldiers as a morale booster, and to children as a special treat in a time of rationing. Nazi propaganda posters featured Fanta. Hitler Youth drank it at rallies. It wasn't just a soda. It was a symbol of German ingenuity under pressure, proof that the fatherland could thrive even without American imports. Max Keith became a hero of German industry, celebrated for his resourcefulness and loyalty, not to Coca-Cola but to Germany, and here's where it gets really interesting. Keith kept meticulous records. He tracked every bottle sold, every pfennig earned, and every transaction, all carefully documented and stored. Why? Because he knew that one day the war would end and Coca-Cola would come looking for its profits, and he was right. When Allied forces liberated Europe and Coca-Cola executives arrived in Germany, Keith handed over his books, showed them the Fanta operation, and explained that he kept the business alive under impossible circumstances. Coca-Cola didn't punish him, they promoted him. They took Fanta, rebranded it with bright orange flavours, stripped away any mention of its Nazi origins, and turned it into a global product. Today, Fanta is sold in over 180 countries, marketed as fun, fruity, and refreshing. Coca-Cola has never apologised for Fanta's origins. They've never acknowledged the Nazi rallies, the swastika-laden advertising, or the fact that their German subsidiary spent years profiting from fascism. Instead, they rewrote the story, turning Fanta into a cheerful tale of innovation and resilience. It's a masterclass in corporate amnesia. So yes, when you drink a Fanta, you're sipping on a beverage invented to quench the thirst of the Third Reich. Enjoy responsibly. Thomas Watson, the head of IBM, loved efficiency. He loved numbers, systems, and making sure everything ran like a well-oiled machine. So when Nazi Germany came knocking in the 1930s, looking for a way to organize census data and track populations with unprecedented precision, IBM was happy to help. They didn't just sell punch card machines to the Third Reich. They custom-built systems, trained technicians, and maintained operations throughout the war. These weren't just any databases. They were used to categorize people by religion, ethnicity, and location, data that directly enabled the logistics of the Holocaust. IBM's machines helped the Nazis decide who went where, when, and how efficiently they could be transported to concentration camps, and the worst part. IBM's New York headquarters knew. They kept doing business, kept collecting profits, and when the war ended, they quietly packed up their punch cards and moved on like nothing happened. Efficiency, after all, is just good business. Let's talk about what those punch cards actually did. Each card represented a person. Holes were punched in specific positions to indicate characteristics: religion, nationality, occupation, physical traits. Jews were coded as number 3. Romani people had their own code. Homosexuals, political dissidents, disabled individuals, all catalogued with ruthless precision. These cards weren't just filed away in dusty archives. They were fed into IBM's Hollerith machines, early data processors that could sort, count, and cross-reference millions of entries in hours. For the Nazis, this was revolutionary technology. It turned genocide from chaotic violence into an organized bureaucratic process. IBM didn't just sell the machines and walk away, they leased them, which meant they maintained control over the hardware and required regular servicing. IBM technicians travelled to Germany throughout the war, updating systems, repairing machines, and training Nazi operators. They knew exactly what the machines were being used for. Internal memos, contracts, and service records show that IBM's German subsidiary, Der Homag, worked hand-in-hand with the SS and the Reich Statistical Office. They customized punch card systems for specific tasks, tracking Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, organizing deportations to Auschwitz, managing slave labor assignments in factories. Every train schedule, every camp roster, every selection list was processed using IBM technology, and IBM profited handsomely. DuPont became one of the most lucrative subsidiaries in the IBM empire. Thomas Watson received updates on its performance, celebrated its success, and reinvested the profits. Even after the US entered the war, IBM maintained financial ties to DuPont through Swiss intermediaries. The money kept flowing, the machines kept running, and the Holocaust continued with mechanical precision. After the war, IBM claimed they had lost control of DuPont and had no idea how their technology was being used. But researchers later uncovered documents proving that IBM's New York headquarters had detailed knowledge of DuPont's operations. They received reports, approved contracts, and knew their machines were being used for population control and deportations. They chose profit over morality, efficiency over humanity. No IBM executive was ever prosecuted for their role in the Holocaust. The company paid no reparations to survivors. Instead, IBM emerged from the war as a technological leader, pioneering the computer age and building a reputation for innovation. The punch cards were replaced by mainframes, then personal computers, then cloud computing. But the logic remained the same. Data is power, and power is profitable. Today, IBM is a global tech giant, trusted by governments and corporations worldwide. Their Holocaust-era collaboration is rarely mentioned in corporate histories or marketing materials. It's an inconvenient truth, buried beneath decades of rebranding and public relations. But the punch cards are still out there, stored in museums and archives, silent witnesses to a time when efficiency was weaponized and technology served evil. IBM didn't pull triggers or operate gas chambers. They just made the trains run on time, and that, in some ways, is even more chilling. Henry Ford wasn't just an industrial genius. He was also a raging anti-Semite who published a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which spent years blaming Jewish people for every problem in America. Adolf Hitler was a fan, like a huge fan. He kept a life-sized portrait of Ford in his office, cited Ford's writings in Mein Kampf, and in 1938 awarded him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honour Nazi Germany could give a foreigner. Ford accepted it with a smile. But it wasn't just symbolic admiration. Ford's German subsidiary built trucks and vehicles for the Wehrmacht, the Nazi war machine. Even as American soldiers were dying on European battlefields, Ford's factories in Germany were producing military equipment for the enemy. After the war, Ford claimed ignorance, shrugged off the medal, and kept building cars. America, apparently, was ready to forgive and forget, especially if you made a really good truck. Henry Ford's anti-Semitism wasn't a secret or a footnote. It was loud, public, and relentless. Starting in 1920, Ford used the Dearborn Independent to publish a series of articles called The International Jew, The World's Problem. These weren't subtle op-eds. They were full-throated conspiracy theories blaming Jewish people for controlling banks, media, and governments. Ford distributed the paper for free through his car, dealerships, ensuring that millions of Americans read his hateful propaganda. He later compiled the articles into a 4-volume book that was translated into multiple languages, including German. Hitler loved it. He called Ford my inspiration and kept his book on his desk. When the Nazi Party rose to power, Ford's relationship with Germany deepened. His company, Ford Werk, operated a major manufacturing plant in Cologne. As the Nazi regime militarized, Ford Werk pivoted to producing military trucks, engines, and vehicle parts for the Wehrmacht. The factory used forced labor, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and conscripted workers who had no choice but to serve. Conditions were brutal. Workers were beaten, starved, and worked to death. Ford Works' profits soared. Back in America, Ford's executives were well aware of what was happening. They received reports, approved budgets, and monitored production. They knew Ford Works was supporting the Nazi war effort. They didn't stop it. In fact, they found ways to keep the relationship alive even after the US entered the war. Through subsidiaries in neutral countries, Ford continued supplying parts and materials to Germany. It was profitable, it was strategic, and it was treason by any reasonable definition. In 1938, the same year Ford received his Nazi medal, German officials celebrated his 75th birthday with a gala in his honor. Ford's representatives attended, accepted the medal on his behalf, and thanked the Reich for its recognition. Ford never returned the medal. He never denounced Hitler. He never apologized for his anti-Semitic writings. Instead, he issued vague statements about being misunderstood and claimed he was a man of peace. America bought it. After the war, Ford Works was bombed by Allied forces, and Ford sued the US government for damages to his German factories. He argued that his property had been destroyed and demanded compensation. Incredibly, he won. The US government paid Ford for the damage done to factories that had been producing vehicles for the Nazis. It's one of the most absurd outcomes of the post-war settlement. An American company profited from both sides of the conflict and then got paid again for the cleanup. Henry Ford died in 1947, just 2 years after the war ended. His legacy is complicated. He revolutionized manufacturing, pioneered the assembly line, and made cars affordable for millions. But he also spread hate, enabled genocide, and profited from fascism. Today, Ford Motor Company is one of the most iconic American brands. The Nazi medal, rarely mentioned, the forced labor, a footnote, the trucks that carried Wehrmacht soldiers into battle, ancient history. But the assembly line of hate Ford built, intellectual, industrial, and ideological, left a legacy that still haunts us. Every truck, every innovation, every dollar earned carries that history. And America has never fully reckoned with it. War runs on oil. Tanks need fuel. Planes need fuel. Entire armies need fuel. And in the 1940s, one company was more than happy to provide it to everyone: Standard Oil. Through a cozy partnership with the German chemical giant IG Farben, the same company that manufactured Zyklon B gas for the death camps, Standard Oil shared patents, technology, and resources that kept the Nazi war machine running. Even as the United States entered the war, Standard Oil's subsidiaries in neutral countries continued supplying the Third Reich with petroleum products. When a US Senate investigation finally exposed the partnership, Standard Oil executives expressed mild regret, paid a small fine, and went right back to business. Because in the end, fascism is temporary, but fossil fuel profits are forever. Standard Oil's relationship with IG Farben began in the 1920s, long before the Nazis came to power. The two companies signed agreements to share patents and technology for synthetic fuel production, a process that turned coal into gasoline. For Germany, which had limited natural oil reserves, this technology was essential. For Standard Oil, it was a lucrative partnership that opened doors to European markets. Both sides benefited. It was business, nothing personal. But when Hitler rose to power and began militarizing Germany, synthetic fuel became a strategic necessity. The Nazi war machine couldn't run without it. IG Farben ramped up production, building massive synthetic fuel plants across Germany. And Standard Oil continued sharing the technology, even as it became clear that Germany was preparing for war. By the late 1930s, Standard Oil executives knew their patents were being used to fuel the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht. They didn't care. the royalties kept rolling in. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Standard Oil faced a dilemma. The US was officially neutral, but public opinion was turning against Nazi Germany. Continuing, the partnership openly would be bad PR. So Standard Oil got creative. They routed supplies through subsidiaries in neutral countries like Switzerland and Spain. They used shell companies, front organizations and legal loopholes to keep the oil flowing to Germany. Officially, they had no connection to the Reich. Unofficially, they were one of its most important suppliers. Even after the US entered the war in December 1941, Standard Oil found ways to maintain the relationship. They argued that their international subsidiaries were separate legal entities, beyond the reach of US law. They claimed they had no control over what those subsidiaries did with their products. It was a convenient fiction, and for a while, it worked. But in 1942, investigative journalists and government officials began digging into Standard Oil's wartime activities. What they found was damning. Contracts signed after the war started, shipments routed through neutral ports, and profits funneled back to American headquarters. A Senate investigation revealed that Standard Oil had deliberately withheld synthetic rubber technology from the US military while sharing it with IG Farben. At a time when America desperately needed rubber for tires, gas masks, and military equipment, Standard Oil was prioritizing its German partners over its own government. The scandal was explosive. Standard Oil was accused of treason, of putting profits over patriotism, of fueling the enemy while American soldiers died. The company's defense was simple. They were a global corporation, not a nationalist entity. Their loyalty was to shareholders, not flags. It was a bold argument, and it almost worked. In the end, Standard Oil paid a fine, a small one, barely a dent in their wartime profits, and signed a consent decree promising to end their collaboration with IG Farben. No executives were prosecuted. No one went to jail. The company emerged from the scandal bruised but intact, and within a few years it was back to business as usual. After the war, Standard Oil rebranded as Exxon, Mobil and Chevron, among others. The breakup of the original Standard Oil monopoly scattered the brand but didn't diminish its power. Today, these companies are among the largest and most profitable corporations in the world. Their wartime collaboration with Nazi Germany is a footnote in corporate histories, mentioned briefly if at all. But the lesson was learned. When it comes to oil, loyalty is negotiable, borders are irrelevant, and profit is the only ideology that matters. Standard Oil didn't just fuel both sides of the war. It proved that corporations could operate above nations, beyond morality, and outside the reach of justice, and they're still doing it today. Bayer, the company that gave the world aspirin, also gave Nazi doctors a steady supply of experimental drugs to test on concentration camp prisoners. Through its parent company IG Farben, Bayer funded horrific medical experiments at Auschwitz and other camps using human beings as lab rats to test new medications, anesthetics, and chemical treatments. Prisoners were infected with diseases, given untested drugs, and observed as they suffered and died. Bayer scientists wrote polite letters requesting subjects and received invoices in return. After the war, Bayer re-emerged as a respectable pharmaceutical giant, and many of the executives involved were quietly rehired or never prosecuted. Today, Bayer is one of the most trusted names in medicine. Their past? Not mentioned on the label. Let's talk about what those experiments actually involved. At Auschwitz, Bayer scientists worked closely with Josef Mengele and other SS doctors to test new pharmaceuticals on prisoners. They weren't looking for cures or treatments. They were testing dosages, side effects, and lethality. Prisoners were injected with experimental painkillers to see how much was needed to be effective and how much would kill. They were infected with diseases like typhus and tuberculosis, then given untested drugs to see if they worked. Most didn't. The prisoners died in agony, their suffering meticulously documented in reports sent back to Bayer's headquarters. Bayer didn't conduct these experiments in secret. They paid for them. Invoices show that Bayer purchased prisoners from the SS at a rate of 170 marks per person. The subjects were selected from the camp population, often women, because Bayer scientists wanted to test drugs specifically for female patients. The prisoners had no idea they were being used as guinea pigs. They were told they were receiving medical treatment. Instead, they received poison. One of the most chilling aspects of Bayer's involvement was the language used in their correspondence. Letters between Bayer scientists and SS officers were polite, bureaucratic, almost mundane. "We need 150 women for our experiments," one letter read. "Please send them as soon as possible." Another letter complained about the quality of previous shipments, noting that some of the prisoners had died before the experiments could be completed. The response from the SS was equally businesslike. "We will provide healthier subjects next time." After the war, Allied investigators uncovered these letters and used them as evidence in the Nuremberg trials. IG Farben executives, including those from Bayer, were prosecuted for war crimes. Some were convicted and sentenced to prison, but the sentences were short. Most served less than 5 years, and many were released early for good behaviour. Within a decade, they were back in corporate leadership positions. Bayer rehired several executives who had been directly involved in the experiments, giving them prominent roles in research and development. Bayer's defence was predictable. They claimed they had no knowledge of the experiments, that the decisions were made by rogue scientists, and that the company had been taken over by the Nazi regime. It was a convenient narrative, and the post-war world was eager to move on. Germany needed to be rebuilt, its industries revived, and Bayer was too important to destroy. So the company was allowed to survive, restructure, and rebrand. Today, Bayer is a global pharmaceutical powerhouse, producing everything from aspirin to cancer treatments. Their Auschwitz experiments are mentioned in histories of the Holocaust, but rarely in corporate materials. The company has issued vague apologies, acknowledging moral responsibility for the actions of its predecessor, but it has never paid significant reparations to survivors, never fully opened its archives, and never allowed independent researchers to access all of its wartime documents. The aspirin you take for a headache, the medication you trust to save your life, it all comes from a company that once treated human beings as disposable test subjects. Bayer didn't just collaborate with the Nazis, they profited from the suffering of concentration camp prisoners, turned genocide into a business opportunity, and walked away unpunished. The pills are still safe, the company is still trusted, but the history is still there, buried beneath decades of rebranding and silence. Take 2 and try not to think about it. You know Hugo Boss, the luxury fashion brand, sleek suits, elegant lines, aspirational advertising? Well, in the 1930s and 40s, Hugo Boss was dressing a different kind of client, the SS, the Hitler Youth, and the Nazi Party. The company was an official supplier of uniforms for the Third Reich, stitching together the iconic black SS uniforms that have since become symbols of terror. And it wasn't just about contracts. Hugo Boss himself was a Nazi Party member. The company used forced labour from concentration camps and French prisoners of war to meet production demands. After the war, Boss lost his voting rights and paid a fine, but the company kept his name, rebuilt its reputation, and never looked back. Now you can buy a Hugo Boss suit for your wedding, your job interview, or your Nazi reenactment. Wait, sorry, scratch that last one. Hugo Boss didn't start out making uniforms for fascists. The company was founded in 1924 as a small garment factory in Metzingen, Germany. Hugo Ferdinand Boss struggled financially through the 1920s, producing workwear, raincoats, and other utilitarian clothing. But when the Great Depression hit, the company nearly went bankrupt. Boss needed a lifeline. He found it in the Nazi Party. In 1931, Hugo Boss joined the Nazi Party, becoming an early supporter of Adolf Hitler's movement. It was a strategic decision as much as an ideological one. The Nazis were rising to power, and they needed uniforms, lots of them. The SA, brown shirts, the SS, black shirts, the Hitler Youth, and the Nazi Party itself all required standardized clothing. Hugo Boss saw an opportunity. He began bidding on government, contracts, undercutting competitors and offering faster production times. By 1933, the year Hitler became Chancellor, Hugo Boss had secured contracts to produce Nazi uniforms. The SS uniforms, in particular, became iconic. Designed by SS officer Karl Diebitsch and graphic designer Walter Heck, the black uniforms were tailored to project authority, discipline, and menace. Hugo Boss didn't design them, but his factory produced them, stitching the silver skulls, eagle insignias, and lightning bolt runes that became symbols of Nazi terror. The uniforms were worn by SS officers as they ran concentration camps, conducted mass executions, and enforced the final solution. Hugo Boss made sure they looked sharp while doing it. As demand for uniforms increased, Hugo Boss expanded his factory and needed more workers. That's where forced labour came in. The company used prisoners of war from France and Poland, as well as forced labourers from Nazi-occupied territories. These workers were not paid. They were barely fed. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions, and if they complained or slowed down, they were beaten or sent to concentration camps. Hugo Boss wasn't unique in this practice. Many German companies used forced labour during the war, but that doesn't make it any less horrific. By 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany, the Hugo Boss factory was struggling. Orders dried up, forced labourers were liberated, and the Nazi regime collapsed. Hugo Boss himself was classified as a follower of the Nazi Party, a lower-level collaborator, and was fined, stripped of his voting rights, and banned from running his own business. But the ban didn't last long. In 1948, just 3 years after the war ended, Boss regained control of his company and began rebuilding. The post-war strategy was simple: rebrand. Hugo Boss stopped making uniforms and pivoted to men's fashion. They produced suits, ties, and formal wear, marketing themselves as a luxury brand for discerning gentlemen. The Nazi uniforms were never mentioned in advertising. The forced labour was buried in the past. The company's wartime activities became an inconvenient detail, quietly scrubbed from corporate histories. It wasn't until 1997 that Hugo Boss publicly acknowledged its Nazi past. The company commissioned an independent historian to investigate its wartime activities, and the resulting report confirmed what researchers already knew. Hugo Boss had been a willing participant in the Nazi war effort, profiting from forced labour and uniform production. The company issued an apology, established a compensation fund for survivors, and promised to be transparent about its history. But transparency has its limits. Hugo Boss is now a global luxury brand, worn by celebrities, politicians, and business leaders. The Nazi uniforms are a historical footnote, mentioned in documentaries and academic papers, but rarely in fashion magazines. The forced labourers who stitch those uniforms are mostly forgotten. The company's past has been acknowledged but not truly reckoned with. So yes, when you wear a Hugo Boss suit, you're wearing the legacy of a company that dressed the Third Reich. The stitching is immaculate, the fabric is fine, and the history is uncomfortable. But fashion, like memory, is selective. And Hugo Boss has chosen to remember only the parts that sell. The Volkswagen Beetle, that cute little rounded car that became a symbol of 1960s counterculture, has a much darker origin. It was designed under Hitler's direct orders as the people's car, affordable transportation for the German masses. The factory that built it used tens of thousands of forced labourers, including concentration camp prisoners and prisoners of war, who worked in brutal conditions, starved, beaten, and expendable. Ferdinand Porsche, the car's designer, collaborated closely with the Nazi regime, and the Volkswagen factory became a cornerstone of the Nazi economy. After the war, the Allies took over the factory and Volkswagen reinvented itself as a quirky, lovable brand. The car became a symbol of peace and freedom, driven by hippies and college students who had no idea it was once built by slaves. Let's start with the name, Volkswagen. Literally, the people's car. It was Hitler's idea, conceived as part of his vision for a motorized Germany, where every family could afford a vehicle. In 1934, Hitler commissioned Ferdinand Porsche to design a small, affordable, reliable car that could be mass-produced. Porsche delivered. The result was the Beetle, a rounded, air-cooled vehicle with a rear-mounted engine. It was simple, efficient, and cheap to build. Hitler loved it, but building the car required a factory, and building a factory required workers. In 1938, construction began on a massive industrial complex in Wolfsburg, a town created specifically to house Volkswagen's workforce. The factory was designed to produce millions of cars, turning Germany into a nation of drivers. But when World War II broke out in 1939, the factory pivoted to military production. Instead of civilian cars, Volkswagen produced military vehicles including the Kübelwagen, a military variant of the Beetle, and ammunition. The people's car became the army's car. To meet production demands, Volkswagen used forced labour on a massive scale. At its peak, the factory employed over 20,000 forced labourers, including concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war and civilians conscripted from occupied territories. These workers were housed in barracks near the factory, given minimal food, and worked 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions. Many died from starvation, disease, or workplace accidents. Those who couldn't work were sent to concentration camps. The conditions were so brutal that even Nazi officials occasionally expressed concern. Inspections noted overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and widespread malnutrition. But nothing changed. Volkswagen needed workers, and forced labour was cheap. The company paid the SS a fee for each prisoner, a fraction of what they would have paid free workers. It was economically efficient and morally catastrophic. Ferdinand Porsche was deeply involved in the factory's operations. He wasn't just the car's designer, he was a Nazi Party member and a close associate of Hitler. He received awards from the regime, dined with Nazi officials, and profited handsomely from Volkswagen's success. After the war, Porsche was briefly imprisoned by French authorities, but was never prosecuted for war crimes. He returned to designing cars and founded the Porsche Company, which became one of the world's most prestigious automotive brands. Volkswagen's post-war transformation is remarkable. When Allied forces liberated Wolfsburg in 1945, they found a factory in ruins and a workforce of starving survivors. The British military took control of the factory and decided to restart production, not for military vehicles, but for civilian cars. The Beetle was resurrected, marketed as affordable, reliable transportation for a war-torn Europe. It was a hit. By the 1950s, Volkswagen was exporting Beetles to the United States, where the car became a cultural icon. Advertisers leaned into its quirky design, emphasizing simplicity and charm. The Think Small campaign of the 1960s repositioned the Beetle as the anti-status symbol, a car for people who valued substance over style. Hippies painted them in psychedelic colors. College students crammed into them for road trips. The Beetle became synonymous with freedom, rebellion, and peace. But the company's Nazi past was never fully addressed. Volkswagen acknowledged using forced labour, but downplayed the scale and severity. It wasn't until the 1990s that the company established a compensation fund for surviving forced labourers. Even then, the payments were minimal, and many survivors received nothing. Today, Volkswagen is one of the largest automakers in the world, producing everything from economy cars to luxury SUVs. The Beetle has been discontinued, but its legacy lives on in advertising, nostalgia, and pop culture. The forced labourers who built it are mostly forgotten. The factory in Wolfsburg still operates, now producing electric vehicles for a carbon-neutral future. The past has been acknowledged, apologised for, and carefully packaged into a narrative of redemption. But the truth remains: the people's car was built by people who had no choice, no freedom, and no hope. And the company that profited from their suffering is still thriving, still trusted, still selling the dream of the open road. Just don't ask who paved it. Nestlé has always marketed itself as a family-friendly company that cares about nutrition and mothers, but in the 1940s and beyond, Nestlé was aggressively pushing infant formula in developing countries, convincing mothers that formula was better than breast milk. They handed out free samples in hospitals, just enough to disrupt natural milk production, and then charged for the rest. In areas without clean water, this led to deadly consequences. Babies died from contaminated formula. Nestlé knew. They didn't stop. In fact, they doubled down on marketing, hiring nurses to promote formula and undermining public health campaigns. The World Health Organization eventually intervened, but by then the damage was done. Nestlé's response? A shrug and a reminder that they're in the business of selling products, not saving lives. Nestlé's infant formula strategy began in the early 20th century, but it accelerated dramatically after World War II. The company saw a business opportunity in developing countries where healthcare infrastructure was weak and mothers were vulnerable to marketing. Nestlé positioned formula as modern, scientific and superior to breast milk. They hired nurses, called milk nurses, to visit hospitals and maternity wards dressed in crisp white uniforms that made them look like medical professionals. These nurses weren't employed by hospitals, they were employed by Nestlé. Their job was to promote formula, hand out free samples, and convince new mothers that breastfeeding was old-fashioned and inferior. The free samples were the key to the strategy. Mothers would receive enough formula to last a few weeks, just long enough for their natural milk production to stop. Once that happened, they were dependent on formula. But formula was expensive, far beyond what most families in developing countries could afford. Mothers would dilute the formula to make it last longer, reducing its nutritional value. Or they would mix it with contaminated water, because clean water wasn't always available. Babies got sick. Babies died. Nestlé knew this was happening. Internal documents and reports from the field described the problem in detail. Malnutrition, diarrhea, dehydration, infant mortality. But the company didn't pull back. Instead, they ramped up marketing using radio ads, billboards, and posters to promote formula. They targeted hospitals, bribing administrators to allow milk nurses access to maternity wards. They sponsored medical conferences, funding doctors who promoted formula over breastfeeding. It was a coordinated, aggressive campaign designed to create dependency. By the 1970s, the backlash began. Activists, doctors, and public health officials started documenting the harm caused by Nestlé's formula marketing. A 1974 report titled The Baby Killer accused Nestlé of contributing to infant deaths in developing countries. The report sparked international outrage, leading to protests, boycotts, and calls for regulation. Nestlé's response was to sue for libel. The company claimed it was being unfairly attacked, that its products were safe, and that it was simply providing mothers with choices. The trial became a public relations disaster for Nestlé. Witnesses testified about babies dying from contaminated formula, about mothers being misled by marketing, about milk nurses pressuring women to stop breastfeeding. The judge ultimately ruled in Nestlé's favour on a technicality, but the damage was done. The company's reputation was in tatters, and the boycott movement grew. In 1981, the World Health Organization adopted the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, a set of guidelines designed to prevent exploitative marketing practices. The code banned free samples, restricted advertising, and prohibited companies from using healthcare workers to promote formula. Nestlé initially resisted the code but eventually agreed to comply under pressure from activists and governments. But compliance was selective. Investigations over the following decades found that Nestlé continued to violate the code in various countries, using loopholes and local subsidiaries to circumvent regulations. The company paid fines, issued apologies, and promised to do better, but the pattern repeated itself: aggressive marketing, public outcry, apology, repeat. Today, Nestlé is one of the largest food and beverage companies in the world, with products in nearly every grocery store on the planet. Infant formula is still a major part of their business, and they still face accusations of unethical marketing. The company has established ethics committees, published sustainability reports, and pledged to follow international guidelines. But the history remains. Nestlé built part of its empire by exploiting vulnerable mothers, selling them products that killed their babies, and prioritizing profit over public health. The free samples are still handed out, though more carefully now. The marketing is still aggressive, though more subtle. And babies are still dying, though the numbers are harder to track. Nestlé didn't invent infant formula, and they're not the only company selling it. But they perfected the art of turning life or death choices into marketing opportunities. And they're still doing it, one free sample at a time. Coco Chanel, fashion icon and creator of Chanel No. 5, spent World War II in the Ritz Hotel in Paris, living comfortably with her Nazi officer boyfriend. Yes, while France was under occupation, Chanel was cozying up to the enemy, literally. She used her Nazi connections to try to seize control of her perfume business from her Jewish partners, leveraging wartime laws to steal what they had built together. After the war, Chanel fled to Switzerland to avoid prosecution, but later returned to France and rebuilt her empire. Her collaboration with the Nazis was quietly buried, and Chanel No. 5 remained one of the most iconic fragrances in the world. Wear it if you want. Just know it smells faintly of betrayal. Let's set the scene. June 1940. German forces have just marched into Paris, and France has surrendered. The city is under Nazi occupation, and most Parisians are terrified, uncertain, trying to survive. Coco Chanel, meanwhile, moved into the Ritz Hotel, one of the most luxurious hotels in Paris. She didn't just check in. She set up residence, living there for the duration of the war, and she wasn't alone. Her companion was Baron Hans Günther von Dinklage, a German intelligence officer and known Nazi operative. They were lovers, openly, comfortably, while France suffered under occupation. Chanel's relationship with von Dinklage wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. She used his connections to navigate the Nazi bureaucracy, protect her assets, and advance her business interests. And one of those interests was seizing control of Chanel No. 5, the perfume that had made her famous but that she didn't fully own. In 1924, Chanel had partnered with Pierre and Paul Wertheimer, two Jewish businessmen, to produce and distribute the perfume. The Wertheimers owned 70% of the company. Chanel owned 10%. She had spent years resenting the arrangement, feeling she deserved more. When the Nazis occupied France, they implemented Aryanization laws that confiscated Jewish-owned businesses and transferred them to non-Jewish owners. Chanel saw an opportunity. She filed legal papers claiming that the Wertheimers had abandoned the business and that she, as an Aryan, should take control. It was a calculated attempt to exploit Nazi racial laws for personal gain. But the Wertheimers were smarter. Before fleeing France, they had transferred ownership of the perfume company to a non-Jewish French businessman, a trusted associate who would hold it until the war ended. The transfer was legal, and Chanel's claim was rejected. She didn't get the company, but she tried, and she used Nazi law to do it. Chanel's collaboration didn't stop there. In 1943, she became involved in Operation Model Hut, a bizarre Nazi intelligence scheme. The plan was to use Chanel as a messenger to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whom she'd met socially before the war. The idea was that Chanel would travel to Madrid, contact British officials, and propose a separate peace between Germany and Britain, cutting out the Soviet Union. The plan was delusional, poorly conceived, and ultimately went nowhere. But Chanel agreed to participate, travelling to Madrid under Nazi orders. The mission failed, but the collaboration was real. When the war ended in 1945, France was in a vengeful mood. Collaborators were arrested, tried, and in many cases executed or imprisoned. Women who had relationships with Nazi officers had their heads shaved in public and were paraded through the streets in humiliation. Chanel should have faced similar consequences, but she didn't. Some historians believe she was protected by Churchill, who intervened to prevent her arrest. Others suggest she had dirt on powerful people, secrets, affairs, blackmail material that kept her safe. Whatever the reason, she was never prosecuted. Instead, Chanel fled to Switzerland, where she lived in comfortable exile for nearly a decade. She spent the time quietly, waiting for the scandal to fade, and it did. By 1954, she felt safe enough to return to Paris and relaunch her fashion house. The comeback was initially met with skepticism, but Chanel's designs, elegant, timeless, quintessentially French, won over critics and customers. Within a few years, she was back on top, as influential and celebrated as ever. Chanel No. 5, meanwhile, had become a global phenomenon. The Wertheimers regained control of the perfume company after the war, and they made Chanel a very wealthy woman through royalties. She never publicly apologized for trying to steal the company. She never addressed her relationship with von Dinklage or her participation in Nazi intelligence schemes. She simply moved on, and the world let her. Today, Chanel No. 5 is one of the most recognizable and best-selling perfumes in history. It's marketed as sophisticated, timeless, and glamorous. The Nazi collaboration, rarely mentioned. Coco Chanel is remembered as a fashion revolutionary, a feminist icon, a woman who defied conventions and created an empire. Her wartime activities are footnotes in biographies, uncomfortable details that don't fit the brand narrative. But the truth is still there, preserved in archives, testimonies, and legal documents. Coco Chanel collaborated with Nazis, tried to steal from her Jewish partners, and lived comfortably while France burned. She was never punished, never fully held accountable. Instead, she was forgiven, celebrated, and turned into a legend. The perfume still sells, the brand still thrives, and the past, like a faint scent, lingers just beneath the surface. Close enough to notice if you're paying attention, easy to ignore if you're not. Kodak, the company that captured your family memories, also captured profits from Nazi Germany. Kodak's German subsidiary used slave labour from concentration camps and continued operating throughout the war. They produced cameras, film, and optical equipment for the German military, all while Kodak's American executives claimed they had lost control of the subsidiary. After the war, Kodak quietly resumed normal operations in Germany, and the company's role in supporting the Nazi war effort was swept under the rug. Your vacation photos were brought to you by the same company that helped document a genocide one way or another. Kodak's relationship with Nazi Germany began long before the war. The company established a German subsidiary, Kodak AG, in the early 20th century, and by the 1930s it was one of the most successful branches of the Kodak empire. When Hitler came to power, Kodak didn't pull out. They stayed, adapted, and thrived. The company's German operations continued producing cameras and film for both civilian and military markets, and as the Nazi regime militarized, Kodak's products became essential tools for reconnaissance, propaganda, and documentation. During the war, Kodak AG produced cameras, aerial photography equipment, and detonators for German forces. These weren't side products, they were core to the war effort. Kodak cameras were used in reconnaissance planes to photograph enemy positions. Kodak film captured Nazi propaganda, documenting rallies, military parades, and victories. And Kodak detonators were used in bombs and artillery shells. The company was deeply embedded in the Nazi war machine. To meet production demands, Kodak AG used forced labor. Workers from concentration camps, prisoners of war, and conscripted civilians were brought into Kodak factories to assemble cameras, process film, and manufacture military equipment. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions with little food and no pay. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or workplace accidents. Kodak didn't run the camps, but they benefited from the system. They paid the SS for the labor, a fraction of what they would have paid free workers, and kept production running smoothly. Back in the United States, Kodak's executives claimed they had no control over their German subsidiary. They argued that once the war started, communication was severed, and they couldn't influence what was happening in Germany. It was a convenient story, and for a long time it was accepted. But researchers later uncovered documents showing that Kodak maintained contact with its German operations throughout the war. Reports were filed, profits were tracked, and executives in Rochester, New York knew exactly what was happening in Berlin. They chose not to intervene. After the war, Kodak faced a choice: acknowledge their role in supporting the Nazi war effort or bury it. They chose burial. The company quietly resumed operations. In Germany, rehiring many of the same executives who had run Kodak AG during the war. There were no investigations, no prosecutions, no public reckoning. Kodak issued vague statements about the difficulty of doing business during wartime and moved on. In the decades that followed, Kodak became synonymous with family memories, vacations, weddings, and childhood. Their advertising emphasized nostalgia, emotion, and the importance of capturing life's precious moments. The company's wartime activities were forgotten, buried beneath layers of feel-good marketing and cultural nostalgia. Kodak moments didn't include concentration camps or forced labor. They were about happiness, love, and memory. But the history is still there. Kodak's cameras documented the Holocaust, both as tools used by Nazis to record their crimes and as instruments used by liberators to document the horrors they found. Kodak film captured images of emaciated prisoners, mass graves, and gas chambers. Some of the most iconic photographs of the Holocaust were taken on Kodak film. The company helped create the visual record of genocide, even as it profited from the regime that committed it. Today, Kodak is a shadow of its former self, diminished by the digital revolution and bankruptcy. But the brand still exists, still sells film and cameras, still trades on nostalgia for the days when photography meant something tangible. Their Nazi-era activities are rarely mentioned, an inconvenient footnote in a story that's supposed to be about preserving memories, not profiting from atrocities. But the truth remains, Kodak stayed in Nazi Germany, used forced labour, supplied the war effort, and walked away unpunished. The photos are real, the profits were real, and the silence is still deafening. So next time you look at an old photograph, think about who made the camera, who processed the film, and what other images might have been captured on the same equipment. History isn't just what we remember, it's also what we choose to forget. General Motors, one of America's largest corporations, owned a major stake in Opel, a German car manufacturer that produced trucks for the Nazi military. Even as American GMs were fighting in Europe, GM's German factories were building vehicles for the Wehrmacht. GM executives later claimed they had no control over their German operations during the war, but records show they were receiving reports and profits right up until the US entered the conflict. After the war, GM even sued the US government for compensation for damage to its German factories caused by Allied bombing. They won. So yes, GM made money from both sides of the war, and then made money again from the cleanup. General Motors didn't just dabble in the German market, they dominated it. In 1929, GM purchased an 80% stake in Adam Opel AG, making it one of the largest foreign investments in German industry at the time. Opel became GM's European flagship, producing cars and trucks that quickly became synonymous with German engineering and reliability. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, Opel was the largest automobile manufacturer in Germany, and GM was reaping enormous profits from its German subsidiary. As the Nazi regime began rearming Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Opel shifted production to meet military needs. The company started building the Opel Blitz, a 3-ton truck that would become the workhorse of the Wehrmacht. These weren't civilian vehicles repurposed for military use. They were designed and built specifically for the German army. The Blitz carried troops to the front lines, transported ammunition and supplies, and served as mobile command centres. By the outbreak of World War II, Opel was producing thousands of these trucks annually, and they were rolling off assembly lines designed and managed with GM's expertise. Here's where the story gets interesting. GM executives in Detroit claimed they lost control of Opel once the war started. They argued that Nazi authorities had seized the company, that communication had been cut off, and that they had no influence over what was being produced in their German factories. It was a clean narrative, one that absolved GM of responsibility for arming the enemy. But it wasn't true. Declassified documents and internal GM memos reveal a different story. GM maintained financial ties to Opel throughout the 1930s and into the early 1940s. Executives received regular reports on production, profits and operations. They knew Opel was building military trucks. They knew those trucks were being used by the Wehrmacht, and they continued to benefit financially from those sales, routing profits through subsidiaries in neutral countries like Switzerland. Even after the US entered the war in December 1941, GM's lawyers worked to protect the company's interest in Germany, arguing that Opel was a separate legal entity and that GM's American operations bore no responsibility for what happened overseas. The scale of Opel's contribution to the Nazi war effort was staggering. By 1944, the company had produced over 100,000 trucks for the German military. These vehicles were used in the invasion of Poland, the Blitzkrieg through France, and the brutal Eastern Front campaigns against the Soviet Union. American soldiers fighting in Europe faced enemies transported in GM-built trucks. It's a bitter irony. GM was producing vehicles for both sides of the conflict, profiting from the deaths of the very soldiers whose government would later bail out the company during the financial crisis of 2008. After the war, GM had the audacity to claim victim status. The company filed a lawsuit against the US government, arguing that Allied bombing raids had damaged its Opel factories and that it deserved compensation for the destruction of its property. The claim was based on the idea that Opel was a neutral corporate entity, caught in the crossfire of war, and that GM's American shareholders had suffered financial losses as a result. Astonishingly, the US government agreed. GM was awarded over $33 million in compensation, equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's currency. Let that sink in. General Motors built trucks for the Nazi war machine, profited from both sides of the conflict, and then received taxpayer money to compensate them for damage done to factories that had armed America's enemies. No executives were prosecuted, no apologies were issued. GM simply took the money, rebuilt its German operations, and moved on. Today, GM is still one of the largest automakers in the world, producing everything from pickup trucks to electric vehicles. Opel was sold off in 2017, severed from GM's corporate structure after nearly 90 years. The company's Nazi-era activities are rarely mentioned in corporate histories or advertising campaigns. Instead, GM emphasizes innovation, American manufacturing, and patriotism. But the history is still there, documented in archives, legal filings, and the rusted remains of Wehrmacht trucks scattered across European battlefields. General Motors didn't just collaborate with the Nazis, they armed them, profited from them, and then billed the American taxpayer for the cleanup. It's corporate opportunism at its finest, and it's never been fully accounted for. Chase Bank, now one of the largest financial institutions in the world, operated in Nazi-occupied Paris during World War II. And what did they do? They froze Jewish customers' accounts and turned them over to the Nazis. Chase claimed they were following local laws, but those laws were explicitly designed to confiscate Jewish wealth. After the war, victims and their families tried to reclaim their money. Chase dragged its feet for decades. Some accounts were never returned. The bank expressed regret eventually, but never faced serious consequences. So next time you deposit a check at Chase, just remember, they've got a history of holding on to money that isn't theirs. In June 1940, when German forces occupied Paris, most foreign banks shut down their French operations and fled. Chase National Bank, which later merged with JP Morgan to become JP Morgan Chase, decided to stay. The decision was framed as a business necessity. Closing the Paris branch would mean abandoning assets, losing market share, and ceding ground to competitors. But staying meant collaborating with the Nazi occupation authorities, and that collaboration quickly turned sinister. The Vichy government, the Nazi puppet regime that governed unoccupied France, enacted a series of anti-Jewish laws designed to strip Jewish citizens of their property, businesses, and bank accounts. These laws required banks to identify Jewish account holders, freeze their assets, and report them to French and German authorities. Chase complied. The bank's Paris branch systematically went through its records, marked accounts held by Jewish customers, and froze them. The account holders couldn't withdraw their money, couldn't transfer it, couldn't access it in any way. Their wealth was locked in place, waiting to be confiscated. Chase employees in Paris knew exactly what they were doing. Internal memos show that bank officials discussed the anti-Jewish laws and their implications. They understood that freezing these accounts would lead to the confiscation of Jewish wealth. But they followed orders anyway, prioritizing the bank's relationship with the occupation authorities over the rights and safety of their customers. Some Jewish account holders were already fleeing France, trying to escape the roundups and deportations that were beginning to sweep through Paris. They needed their money to survive, to bribe officials, to buy passage out of the country. Chase denied them access. The confiscated funds were transferred to Nazi authorities or absorbed into the Vichy government's budget. In many cases, the money was used to fund the occupation itself, paying for German military operations, propaganda campaigns, and the bureaucracy of genocide. Jewish families lost their life savings, their businesses, and often their lives, and Chase profited. The bank collected fees for managing the frozen accounts, maintained its operations in Paris, and preserved its market position. When the war ended and Paris was liberated in August 1944, Chase was still there, still operating, still holding on to accounts that didn't belong to them. After the liberation, Jewish survivors and their families began the difficult process of trying to reclaim their assets. They approached Chase with documentation, old passbooks, account statements, letters from before the war. The bank's response was bureaucratic obstruction. Chase demanded extensive proof of ownership, required death, certificates for relatives who had been murdered in concentration camps, and imposed fees for processing claims. Many survivors, traumatized and impoverished, couldn't navigate the paperwork. Others were simply ignored. The process dragged on for years, then decades. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the full scope of Chase's wartime collaboration began to emerge. Researchers investigating Swiss bank accounts stumbled across records showing that Chase and other American banks had frozen Jewish accounts in occupied France. A class action lawsuit was filed against Chase in 1999, accusing the bank of collaborating with the Nazis and profiting from the confiscation of Jewish wealth. The case brought renewed attention to Chase's wartime activities and forced the bank to confront its past. Chase's initial response was predictable: denial. The bank claimed it had no choice but to follow local laws, that its employees were simply doing what was required to keep the branch operating, and that holding the bank responsible for the actions of a brutal occupation regime was unfair. But as more documents surfaced, the defense became harder to maintain. Internal memos showed that Chase had options. Other banks had closed their Paris branches. Some had refused to cooperate with anti-Jewish laws. Chase chose collaboration. In 2000, facing mounting legal and public pressure, Chase agreed to settle the lawsuit. The bank paid out millions of dollars to survivors and their families, though the amount was a fraction of what had been stolen. Chase also issued a public apology, acknowledging that its Paris branch had assisted the Nazis in their campaign to confiscate Jewish assets. But the apology came 55 years after the war ended, long after most of the victims had died, and the settlement included no admission of legal wrongdoing, just a vague expression of regret. Today, JP Morgan Chase is one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, managing trillions of dollars in assets and serving millions of customers. The bank's wartime activities in Paris are a footnote in its corporate history, mentioned briefly in academic studies and historical documentaries, but rarely in the glossy annual reports sent to shareholders. The French branch still operates, still serves customers, still makes money. The frozen accounts, mostly forgotten. The Jewish families who lost everything, their stories buried in archives, legal filings, and fading memories. Chase may have expressed regret, but regret doesn't pay rent. And for a bank that made a fortune holding on to money that wasn't theirs, regret is a cheap currency. Siemens, the German engineering giant, didn't just build household appliances. During World War II, they built the gas chambers. Specifically, they supplied electrical systems and generators to concentration camps, including Auschwitz. They used slave labour extensively, working prisoners to death in their factories and construction sites. After the war, Siemens paid minimal reparations and continued operating as a respected global brand. Today, Siemens is in your dishwasher, your hospital, your train station. Their past, hidden behind a logo. Siemens was founded in 1847 as a telegraph company, and by the early 20th century it had become one of Europe's largest and most innovative engineering firms. The company built power plants, electrical grids, medical equipment, and telecommunication systems. When the Nazis came to power, Siemens didn't resist. The company saw opportunity in the regime's massive infrastructure projects, the Autobahn, the rearmament campaign, and eventually the concentration camp system. Siemens became one of the largest suppliers of electrical equipment to the Third Reich. They provided generators, switchboards, wiring, and power systems to military installations, factories, and camps. At Auschwitz, the largest and most notorious of the Nazi death camps, Siemens installed electrical systems that powered the camp's operations, including the gas chambers and crematoria. The company didn't design the gas chambers, that was done by Nazi engineers, but Siemens provided the infrastructure that made mass murder efficient and mechanized. The gas chambers at Auschwitz required ventilation systems to remove the poisonous Zyklon B gas after each killing. They needed electrical lighting so guards could see what they were doing. They needed power for the crematoria, which burned thousands of bodies every day. Siemens supplied the generators and electrical panels that made all of this possible. Company engineers visited the camp, assessed the power needs, and designed systems specifically for the site. They knew what they were building. They did it anyway. Siemens also used forced labor on a massive scale. The company operated factories inside and near concentration camps, employing prisoners as unpaid workers. At Auschwitz, Siemens ran a factory that produced electrical components using prisoner labor. The conditions were brutal. 12-hour shifts, minimal food, constant beatings. Prisoners who couldn't keep up were sent to the gas chambers. Those who survived were worked until they collapsed. Siemens paid the SS a small fee for each prisoner, a fraction of what they would have paid free workers. It was economically efficient and morally monstrous. Siemens wasn't the only German company using slave labor, but it was one of the most aggressive. At its peak, the company employed tens of thousands of forced laborers across its network of factories and construction sites. Many were Jewish prisoners from concentration camps. Others were Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, and conscripted workers from occupied territories. They built power plants, assembled electrical equipment, and dug tunnels for underground factories. Thousands died from exhaustion, starvation, and abuse. After the war, Allied investigators documented Siemens' role in the Nazi war effort. Company executives were questioned, and some were prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials. But the sentences were light, a few years in prison at most, and many were released early. Siemens itself was not dismantled or permanently shut down. Instead, the company was allowed to restructure, rebrand, and continue operating. In the decades that followed, Siemens became a symbol of German industrial resurgence. The company rebuilt its factories, expanded into new markets, and became a global leader in engineering and technology. Today, Siemens products are everywhere, in homes, hospitals, factories, and transportation systems. The company has established ethics programs, published sustainability reports, and donated to Holocaust memorial projects, but it has never fully accounted for its wartime activities. Compensation for forced laborers came late and reluctantly. It wasn't until the late 1990s that Siemens, under pressure from survivors' groups and class action lawsuits, contributed to a German government fund for forced labor victims. The payments were modest, often just a few $1,000s per survivor. Many former prisoners received nothing because they had died, couldn't prove their employment, or were excluded by bureaucratic rules. Siemens' official history acknowledges the company's use of forced labor and its collaboration with the Nazi regime, but the language is carefully sanitized. The gas chambers are mentioned vaguely, if at all. The generators that powered Auschwitz are described as electrical installations with no context provided. The company's narrative emphasizes rebuilding, innovation, and social responsibility, not complicity in genocide. But the truth is still there, preserved in archives, testimony, and the physical remnants of the camps. At Auschwitz, visitors can still see the electrical panels and generator housings marked with the Siemens logo. They're relics of a time when engineering genius was put in service of evil, when efficiency was weaponized, and when a company prioritized profit over human life. Siemens didn't pull the triggers or operate the gas chambers, but they made sure the light stayed on while it happened, and they've never truly answered for it. Allianz, one of the world's largest insurance companies, insured Nazi facilities, including concentration camps. They also refused to pay out life insurance policies to Jewish families, citing acts of war or claiming the policyholder had fled the country. Allianz executives were deeply embedded in the Nazi regime, and the company profited handsomely from Aryanization, the forced transfer of Jewish businesses to non-Jewish owners. After the war, Allianz paid small settlements, but never fully accounted for the policies it stole. Today, they're still selling insurance, still trusted, still quiet about the past. Allianz was founded in 1890 in Berlin and quickly became one of Europe's most successful insurance companies. By the 1930s, Allianz was operating across Germany and had expanded into international markets. When the Nazis came to power, the company's leadership saw an opportunity. They aligned themselves with the regime, insured its infrastructure, and profited from its policies of racial persecution and territorial expansion. One of Allianz's most prominent executives was Kurt Schmidt, who served as the company's chairman and later as Hitler's Minister of Economics. Schmidt was a Nazi Party member and a close associate of senior regime officials. Under his leadership, Allianz became the preferred insurance provider for Nazi projects, insuring everything from factories and military installations to the infrastructure of the concentration camp system. Yes, concentration camps were insured. The SS took out policies to protect against property damage, fire, and loss of assets. Allianz underwrote those policies, collecting premiums and processing claims. But Allianz's collaboration went deeper than just insuring Nazi facilities. The company played a central role in Aryanization, the process by which Jewish-owned businesses were confiscated and transferred to non-Jewish owners. When Jewish business owners were forced to sell their companies under duress, often for a fraction of their value, Allianz provided insurance for the new Aryan owners. The company also terminated insurance policies held by Jewish individuals and businesses, citing Nazi racial laws as justification. Jewish policyholders were told their coverage was invalid, that they no longer qualified for protection, or that their policies had been cancelled due to legal changes. Life insurance policies were particularly contentious. Many Jewish families had taken out life insurance policies as a way to provide for their loved ones in case of death. But when the Holocaust began, and policyholders were murdered in concentration camps, their families tried to claim the benefits. Allianz refused to pay. The company argued that death in a concentration camp constituted an act of war, or that the policyholder had disappeared without proof of death. In other cases, Allianz claimed that the policyholder had emigrated and abandoned the policy, even when the person had been forcibly deported and killed. These denials weren't accidents or bureaucratic errors. They were deliberate strategies designed to avoid paying out claims and to profit from the genocide. Internal Allianz documents show that company officials discussed how to handle Holocaust-related claims and decided that denying them was more profitable than honouring them. The money that should have gone to grieving families instead stayed in Allianz's coffers, used to fund expansion and pay dividends to shareholders. After the war, Allied investigators uncovered evidence of Allianz's collaboration with the Nazi regime. Kurt Schmidt was arrested and held for a time but was never prosecuted. Other Allianz executives were questioned but faced no serious consequences. The company itself was allowed to continue operating, and by the 1950s, Allianz was back to business as usual, expanding across Europe and rebuilding its reputation. Survivors and their families spent decades trying to reclaim unpaid insurance benefits. They filed claims with Allianz, provided documentation, and pleaded for the money that was rightfully theirs. Allianz responded with delays, denials, and legalistic runarounds. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when international pressure and class action lawsuits forced the issue, that Allianz began to address its Holocaust-era policies. In 2000, Allianz agreed to participate in a settlement fund for unpaid insurance claims, contributing hundreds of millions of dollars to compensate survivors and their descendants. The company also commissioned an independent historical study of its wartime activities, which confirmed what researchers had long suspected. Allianz had knowingly profited from the Holocaust, denied legitimate claims, and collaborated extensively with the Nazi regime. But the settlement and the apology came more than 50 years after the war. Most of the original policyholders were dead. Their children were elderly. The money, while substantial, was a fraction of what had been stolen. And Allianz continued operating as if nothing had happened, selling insurance, managing assets, and building its brand as a trusted financial partner. Today, Allianz is one of the largest insurance companies in the world, with operations in dozens of countries and trillions of dollars in assets under management. The company's Nazi past is acknowledged in historical reports and academic studies, but it's rarely mentioned in advertising or corporate communications. Allianz sponsors sports teams, cultural events, and sustainability initiatives. It presents itself as responsible, ethical, and forward-thinking. But the history is still there, buried in archives and the memories of those who survived. Allianz ensured the machinery of genocide, denied justice to its victims, and walked away richer for it. And the world let them. After the war, Coca-Cola faced a dilemma. What to do with Fanta, the drink invented for Nazis? The answer: rebrand it. Slap on some bright colours, add orange flavour, market it to kids, and pretend it was always just a fun, fruity soda. The strategy worked. Fanta became a global hit, beloved by children and nostalgic adults alike. Coca-Cola never mentioned its origins in press releases or advertising, and why would they? The past is bad for sales. When the war ended in 1945 and Allied forces liberated Europe, Coca-Cola executives rushed back to Germany to assess the damage and reclaim their business. What they found was surprising. Max Keith, the head of Coca-Cola Germany, had kept the operation alive throughout the war, protected the company's assets, and even turned a profit. He handed over detailed records showing every bottle of Fanta sold, every mark earned, and every business decision made during the occupation. Coca-Cola didn't punish him. They celebrated him as a hero who had preserved the brand under impossible circumstances. But Fanta presented a problem. The drink had been marketed to Nazis, advertised at rallies, and sold to soldiers and civilians who supported the Third Reich. It was tainted by association, and Coca-Cola couldn't just bring it to America and pretend nothing had happened. So they shelved it. Fanta disappeared from the market for nearly a decade, quietly retired while Coca-Cola focused on rebuilding its European operations and re-establishing Coke as the dominant soft drink. But the formula didn't die. In 1955, Coca-Cola decided to resurrect Fanta, this time as a completely different product. The original wartime recipe, made from apple pomace and whey, was scrapped. In its place, Coca-Cola developed a new, orange-flavoured soda, bright, sweet, and aggressively cheerful. The new Fanta was launched in Italy, marketed as a fun, refreshing alternative to Coke, targeted specifically at younger consumers. The branding was colourful, playful, and deliberately devoid of any historical context. There were no references to Germany, no mentions of the war, and certainly no acknowledgement that Fanta had once been the official soft drink of the Nazi regime. The rebranding worked spectacularly. Fanta became a hit in Italy, then spread across Europe and into global markets. By the 1960s, it was available in dozens of countries, each with its own local flavour variations. Orange remained the most popular, but there were also lemon, grape, strawberry, and tropical fruit versions. Coca-Cola marketed Fanta as the fun soda, the drink for people who wanted something different, something less serious than Coke. Advertising campaigns featured bright colours, beach parties, and carefree teenagers. The message was clear. Fanta was about joy, freedom, and youth. Nothing dark, nothing complicated, nothing to worry about. Coca-Cola's strategy was to bury the past through silence and saturation. The company never issued press releases explaining Fanta's origins. They never addressed the Nazi connection in marketing materials or corporate histories. Instead, they flooded the market with new Fanta products, new flavours, and new advertising campaigns, each one reinforcing the idea that Fanta was just a harmless, fun soft drink. Over time, the original story faded from public memory. Most people who drank Fanta had no idea it had been invented for the Third Reich, and Coca-Cola was perfectly happy to keep it that way. It wasn't until the early 2000s that journalists and historians began digging into Fanta's origins and publishing what they found. The story made headlines, briefly, and Coca-Cola was forced to acknowledge the connection. The company's response was carefully calibrated. They confirmed that Fanta had been invented in Nazi Germany, but emphasized that it was a product of wartime necessity, not collaboration. They pointed out that Max Keith had kept the business alive despite the war, not because of it. They stressed that the modern Fanta was a completely different product with a different recipe and a different purpose, and they noted that Coca-Cola itself had been on the side of the Allies, supplying American troops with Coke throughout the war. The explanation was designed to deflect blame while acknowledging just enough truth to seem transparent. It worked. The Fanta story generated some controversy, but it didn't hurt sales. If anything, it became a quirky piece of trivia, a weird historical footnote that people mentioned at parties and then forgot about. Fanta remained popular, especially in Europe and Latin America, where it outsells Coca-Cola in some markets. Today, Fanta is one of the most recognizable soft drink brands in the world, available in over 180 countries and generating billions of dollars in revenue annually. Coca-Cola continues to innovate with new flavors and limited edition releases, each one marketed with the same bright, carefree branding that has defined Fanta since the 1950s. The Nazi origins are acknowledged by the company when directly asked, but are never mentioned in advertising or promotional materials. The story of Fanta is a masterclass in corporate rebranding. Coca-Cola took a product born in fascism, stripped away its history, and turned it into a global icon of fun and youth. They didn't apologize or make amends. They simply moved on, confident that consumers would forget or not care. And they were right. Most people don't think about history when they crack open a cold Fanta on a hot day. They just enjoy the fizz, the sweetness, and the momentary escape from reality. But the history is still there, bubbling just beneath the surface, waiting for anyone curious enough to look. Monsanto, long before it became synonymous with genetically modified crops and glyphosate, was already experimenting with chemicals in the 1940s. They produced PCBs, DDT, and other toxic substances that were widely used in agriculture and industry. They knew the chemicals were dangerous. Internal documents show they were aware of health risks, but they kept producing them anyway. By the time bans and regulations caught up, Monsanto had already made billions. The company's legacy of prioritizing profit over public health started long before Roundup. Monsanto was founded in 1901 by John Francis Queeny, a chemist who started the company to produce saccharin, the artificial sweetener. But the company's real growth came during World War II, when it pivoted to producing industrial chemicals for the war effort. Monsanto manufactured everything from plastics and synthetic rubber to explosives and chemical agents. The war made Monsanto rich, and when it ended, the company was positioned to dominate the post-war chemical industry. One of Monsanto's most profitable products was polychlorinated biphenyls, known as PCBs. These were synthetic chemicals used as coolants and lubricants in electrical equipment, hydraulic systems, and industrial machinery. PCBs were incredibly useful, stable, non-flammable, and long-lasting, but they were also incredibly toxic. Monsanto's own research in the 1930s and 40s showed that PCBs caused liver damage, skin lesions, and other serious health problems in laboratory animals. Workers in Monsanto's PCB plants reported chronic illnesses, rashes, and respiratory issues. The company knew its product was dangerous, but Monsanto didn't stop producing PCBs. Instead, they buried the research, kept selling the chemicals, and expanded production. By the 1960s, Monsanto was the largest producer of PCBs in the United States, manufacturing hundreds of millions of pounds annually. The chemicals were used in transformers, capacitors, and industrial equipment across the country. They were also dumped into rivers, buried in landfills, and released into the environment through industrial accidents and improper disposal. PCBs don't break down easily. They persist in the environment for decades, accumulating in soil, water, and the bodies of living organisms. They contaminate fish, poison drinking water, and cause cancer, neurological damage, and developmental disorders in humans. By the time the US government banned PCBs in 1979, the damage was done. Millions of Americans had been exposed, countless communities had been contaminated, and Monsanto had made billions of dollars in profit. Another Monsanto product from the 1940s was DDT, a pesticide that became one of the most widely used chemicals in agriculture. DDT was initially celebrated as a miracle chemical, effective at killing mosquitoes and other pests, and credited with preventing malaria and typhus during and after World War II. Monsanto didn't invent DDT, but they were one of its largest producers, manufacturing tons of the chemical for both military and civilian use. But DDT had a dark side. It was highly toxic to wildlife, particularly birds, whose eggs became thin and fragile after exposure, leading to population collapses of eagles, falcons, and other species. DDT also accumulated in the human body, with long-term exposure linked to cancer, liver damage, and reproductive issues. Monsanto's internal studies showed these risks, but the company continued producing DDT and downplayed the dangers in public statements and marketing materials. It wasn't until the 1960s, when environmental activists and scientists like Rachel Carson began documenting the devastating effects of DDT, that public opinion turned against the chemical. Carson's book, Silent Spring, published in 1962, exposed the environmental and health hazards of pesticides and sparked a movement that eventually led to the banning of DDT in the United States in 1972. Monsanto fought the ban, lobbying politicians and funding studies that claimed DDT was safe. They lost. Monsanto's strategy throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s was consistent: produce chemicals that were profitable, bury evidence of harm, and fight regulation as long as possible. The company operated on the assumption that profits today mattered more than health consequences tomorrow, and for decades it worked. Monsanto made billions, its executives became wealthy, and the company expanded into new markets and new products. But the legacy of those early chemicals is still with us. PCB contamination sites are scattered across the United States, costing billions of dollars to clean up. DDT persists in the environment, still detectable in soil and water decades after it was banned. And Monsanto, now owned by Bayer after a controversial merger, continues to face lawsuits, protests, and regulatory battles over its products. The company's 1940s experiments weren't just about chemistry. They were about power, the power to produce, to profit, and to ignore the consequences. Monsanto didn't just make toxic chemicals. They made a business model out of poisoning people and then denying responsibility. And that model, refined over decades, became the blueprint for how corporations navigate the line between innovation and harm. The chemicals have changed, but the strategy remains the same. DuPont invented Teflon in the late 1930s, and by the 40s it was being used in military applications. But the chemical used to make Teflon, PFOA, was already known to be toxic. DuPont's own studies showed it caused cancer and birth defects, but they buried the research and continued production. For decades, DuPont dumped PFOA into water supplies, contaminating communities and causing widespread illness. They paid settlements eventually, but only after denying responsibility for years. Your non-stick pan, brought to you by a company that poisoned people and covered it up. Teflon's story begins in 1938, when a DuPont chemist named Roy Plunkett accidentally discovered polytetrafluoroethylene, or PTFE, while experimenting with refrigerants. The substance was slippery, heat-resistant, and chemically inert, perfect for industrial applications. DuPont immediately recognized its potential and began developing commercial uses. During World War II, Teflon was used in military equipment, particularly in the Manhattan Project, where it was essential for handling the highly corrosive materials used in atomic bomb production. But to manufacture Teflon, DuPont needed a processing aid called perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, also known as C8. PFOA was used to keep the Teflon from clumping during production, ensuring a smooth, consistent coating. The problem was that PFOA was toxic. DuPont's own research in the 1960s showed that PFOA caused liver damage, thyroid disease, and developmental problems in laboratory animals. Studies on DuPont workers exposed to PFOA found elevated rates of cancer, kidney disease, and immune system disorders. The company knew the chemical was dangerous, but DuPont didn't stop using PFOA. Instead, they classified the research as confidential, kept it out of the public eye, and continued manufacturing Teflon on a massive scale. Non-stick cookware became a household staple in the 1960s and 70s, marketed as a modern convenience that made cooking easier and cleanup faster. DuPont sold Teflon to cookware manufacturers, industrial clients, and military contractors, all while knowing that the production process was poisoning workers and contaminating the environment. The contamination was worst in Parkersburg, West Virginia, where DuPont operated a massive Teflon production facility. For decades, the plant dumped PFOA-laden waste into the Ohio River and released it into the air. The chemical seeped into the groundwater, contaminating drinking water supplies for tens of thousands of people in nearby communities. Residents drank the water, cooked with it, and bathed in it, unknowingly exposing themselves and their children to a toxic substance that would stay in their bodies for years. By the 1990s, people in Parkersburg started getting sick. Rates of cancer, thyroid disease, and birth defects were unusually high. Livestock on nearby farms were dying from mysterious illnesses. A local farmer named Wilbur Tennant noticed that his cattle were behaving strangely, stumbling, foaming at the mouth, and dying in droves. He contacted DuPont demanding answers. The company sent representatives who claimed the cattle were dying from natural causes. Tennant didn't believe them. He hired a lawyer named Rob Bilott, who began investigating. What Bilott uncovered was damning. Internal DuPont documents showed that the company had known about PFOA's toxicity for decades and had deliberately concealed the risks from regulators, workers, and the public. DuPont had conducted studies showing that PFOA caused cancer in animals and was present in the blood of its workers at dangerous levels. The company had even found PFOA in the blood of pregnant employees and knew it was being passed to their unborn children. But instead of stopping production or warning the public, DuPont buried the evidence and kept dumping PFOA into the environment. Beetle filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the Parkersburg community, and the case dragged on for years. DuPont fought aggressively, denying responsibility and arguing that there was no definitive proof that PFOA caused harm in humans. But the evidence kept mounting. Independent studies confirmed that PFOA was linked to cancer, thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, and other serious health conditions. In 2005, DuPont agreed to fund a health study of the affected community, and the results were devastating. PFOA was found in the blood of nearly everyone tested, at levels far higher than the general population. In 2017, after more than 15 years of litigation, DuPont and its spin-off company Siemens agreed to pay over $600 million to settle thousands of PFOA-related lawsuits. The settlement compensated people who had developed cancer and other illnesses linked to PFOA exposure. But the money didn't undo the damage. People had died, communities had been poisoned, and DuPont had known the whole time. Today, PFOA is no longer used in Teflon production, but it hasn't disappeared. The chemical persists in the environment, contaminating water supplies across the United States and around the world. It's been detected in the blood of nearly every American tested, a legacy of decades of industrial pollution. DuPont, now split into multiple companies, continues to face lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny over PFOA and other forever chemicals that don't break down in the environment. The company's response has been predictable: settle quietly, issue vague apologies, and move on. DuPont emphasizes its commitment to safety, sustainability, and innovation, marketing itself as a responsible corporate citizen. But the history is still there, documented in court filings, scientific studies, and the scars left on communities like Parkersburg. Teflon made cooking easier, but it also poisoned thousands of people, and DuPont knew. They always knew. During World War II, tobacco companies wrapped themselves in the American flag. Cigarettes were included in soldiers' rations, marketed as morale boosters, and advertised as part of the war effort. Lucky Strike even changed its packaging to save metal for the troops. But behind the patriotic marketing, tobacco companies were already aware that smoking caused cancer. Internal research from the 1940s shows they knew. They buried it, kept advertising, and spent decades denying the science. Smoking killed more Americans than the war ever did, but big tobacco made sure the profits kept rolling in. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, tobacco companies saw an opportunity. Millions of young men were being drafted, sent to training camps, and deployed overseas. They were stressed, scared, and far from home. Cigarettes offered a moment of comfort, a brief escape from the horror of war. And tobacco companies made sure cigarettes were everywhere. The US military included cigarettes in soldiers' K rations, the portable meal kits distributed to troops in the field. 4 cigarettes per pack, sometimes more, often brands like Camel, Lucky Strike, or Chesterfield. The cigarettes were free, provided by the military as a morale booster, and soldiers smoked them constantly, during breaks, before battles, after battles, while waiting, while marching, while trying to sleep in foxholes. Smoking became synonymous with military life, and tobacco companies loved it. The marketing was relentless. Print ads featured soldiers in uniform, lighting up after a successful mission or sharing cigarettes with their buddies. Slogans like Lucky Strike Green has gone to war emphasized the patriotic sacrifice of changing packaging colors to save copper for military use. The message was clear. Smoking wasn't just a personal choice. It was an act of patriotism, a way to support the troops and the war effort. Tobacco companies sent millions of free cigarettes to soldiers overseas, sponsored USO shows, and ran campaigns encouraging Americans on the home front to buy cigarettes for the troops. Women were told that sending cigarettes to their husbands, brothers, and sons was a way to show love and support. Smoking became woven into the fabric of American wartime culture, and the tobacco industry reaped enormous profits. But even as they marketed cigarettes as wholesome and patriotic, tobacco companies knew the truth. Internal research conducted in the 1940s showed that smoking caused lung damage, respiratory disease, and cancer. Scientists working for tobacco companies documented the health risks in confidential reports, noting that heavy smokers developed tumours, chronic coughs, and shortened lifespans. The evidence was clear, and it was buried. The strategy was simple: deny, delay, and discredit. Tobacco companies publicly dismissed studies linking smoking to cancer as inconclusive or exaggerated. They funded their own research designed to muddy the waters, producing studies that claimed smoking was safe or that the health risks were overblown. They hired scientists, doctors, and public relations firms to cast doubt on the emerging scientific consensus. And they kept advertising, kept selling, and kept profiting. By the 1950s, the link between smoking and lung cancer was becoming undeniable. Independent researchers published studies showing that smokers were far more likely to develop cancer than non-smokers. The evidence was overwhelming, but tobacco companies doubled down on denial, launching a coordinated campaign to discredit the research and protect their profits. In 1954, tobacco executives held a secret meeting at the Plaza Hotel in New York and agreed on a unified strategy: publicly question the science, fund counter-research, and never admit that smoking caused cancer. They formed the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, a front group designed to create the illusion of scientific inquiry while actually serving as a PR tool to defend the industry. The committee funded studies, published reports, and issued statements claiming that the health risks of smoking were unproven. It was a masterclass in corporate propaganda. The strategy worked for decades. Millions of Americans continued smoking, believing the industry's reassurances that cigarettes were safe or that the risks were minimal. Soldiers who had started smoking during the war became lifelong customers, and tobacco companies marketed aggressively to new generations. By the time the Surgeon General issued a definitive report in 1964, confirming that smoking caused lung cancer, heart disease, and other serious illnesses, it was too late for millions of people. They were already addicted, already sick, already dying. Tobacco companies continued fighting regulation, lobbying against warning labels, advertising restrictions and public health campaigns. They targeted teenagers with cartoon mascots, celebrities, and aspirational advertising. They expanded into international markets, selling cigarettes in countries with weak health regulations and no public awareness of the risks. And they kept denying responsibility, even as the bodies piled up. Today, smoking is recognized as one of the leading causes of preventable death worldwide, killing more than 8 million people annually. The tobacco industry has paid billions of dollars in settlements, agreed to warning labels and advertising restrictions, and been forced to admit, finally, that smoking causes cancer. But the companies are still operating, still selling cigarettes, and still profiting from addiction. The wartime marketing of cigarettes as patriotic, wholesome, and morale-boosting was a lie. It was a calculated strategy to hook a generation of soldiers on a product that would kill them slowly over decades. And the tobacco industry knew it all along. They wrapped themselves in the flag, sold poison to heroes, and walked away rich. The soldiers came home, many of them never stopped smoking, and the companies that started them down that path are still here, still selling, still denying, still counting their profits. Dow Chemical, which would later become infamous for producing Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, got its start in chemical weapons during World War II. They produced napalm, a jellied gasoline that stuck to skin and burned at extreme temperatures. It was used extensively in the Pacific Theatre, incinerating entire villages and causing horrific casualties. Dow knew what their product did. They didn't care. It was war, and war was profitable. Dow Chemical was founded in 1897, initially producing bleach and other industrial chemicals. But the company's real growth came during World War II, when it became a major supplier of chemicals to the US military. Dow produced plastics, synthetic rubber, magnesium for aircraft, and a range of chemical agents used in warfare. One of their most profitable and devastating products was napalm. Napalm was developed in 1942 by a team of Harvard chemists working for the US military. The goal was to create an incendiary weapon that burned hotter and longer than gasoline, something that would stick to targets and couldn't be easily extinguished. The result was a mixture of gasoline and a thickening agent made from aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids, hence the name napalm. Dow Chemical was one of the primary manufacturers, producing thousands of tons of the stuff for use in flamethrowers and firebombs. Napalm was first used in the Pacific Theatre, where it proved devastatingly effective. US forces deployed it against Japanese fortifications, bunkers, and troops hiding in caves and jungles. Flamethrowers sprayed jellied fire that clung to everything it touched, burning through clothing, skin, and bone. Firebombs dropped from aircraft incinerated entire military positions, turning defensive lines into infernos. The weapon was terrifying, both for its lethality and its psychological impact. Soldiers who witnessed napalm attacks described scenes of unimaginable horror, people running while on fire, screaming until their lungs burned out, collapsing into charred remains. But napalm wasn't just used on military targets. It was also deployed against civilian areas in Japan, particularly during the firebombing campaigns of 1945. The most infamous attack was the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, when American B-29 bombers dropped thousands of napalm incendiary bombs on the densely populated city. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would later kill in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The fires were so intense that the canals boiled, and people who jumped in to escape the flames were cooked alive. Dow Chemical's napalm made it all possible. After the war, Dow didn't stop producing napalm. The company continued manufacturing it for use in Korea and later Vietnam, where it became one of the most notorious weapons of the conflict. Images of Vietnamese children running from napalm strikes, their skin burning, became some of the most iconic and horrifying symbols of the war. Dow faced protests, boycotts, and public condemnation, but the company defended its role, arguing that it was fulfilling government contracts and that napalm was a legitimate military tool. But Dow's involvement in chemical warfare didn't end with napalm. In the 1960s, the company became one of the primary manufacturers of Agent Orange, a herbicide used by the US military to defoliate jungles in Vietnam. Agent Orange was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals known to humanity. It caused cancer, birth defects, neurological damage, and a host of other serious health problems in both Vietnamese civilians and American soldiers. Dow knew the chemical was dangerous, internal studies showed the risks, but they kept producing it. The pattern is consistent. Dow Chemical produces a product, knows it causes harm, and prioritizes profit over people. Whether it's napalm burning civilians alive or Agent Orange poisoning entire generations, The company's response has always been the same: deny responsibility, defend contracts, and keep selling. After the Vietnam War, Dow faced thousands of lawsuits from veterans exposed to Agent Orange. The company fought them for years, denying that Agent Orange caused health problems and arguing that it was simply fulfilling government orders. Eventually, Dow and other chemical manufacturers agreed to a settlement, paying billions of dollars to veterans. But the Vietnamese victims, who suffered far worse and in far greater numbers, received nothing. Dow never apologized to them, never compensated them, and never acknowledged the full scope of the damage. Today, Dow Chemical is a global conglomerate, producing everything from plastics and packaging to agricultural chemicals and pharmaceuticals. The company emphasizes sustainability, innovation, and corporate responsibility in its marketing. But the history is still there, etched in the scarred bodies of napalm victims, the poisoned land of Vietnam, and the ongoing health crises faced by those exposed to Agent Orange. Dow didn't invent chemical warfare, but they perfected the business model. Manufacture weapons of mass suffering, deny the consequences, and profit from the destruction. Napalm and Agent Orange weren't just products. They were expressions of corporate indifference to human life. And Dow Chemical has never truly answered for it. John Harvey Kellogg, co-founder of the Kellogg cereal empire, was a fervent believer in eugenics, the pseudoscience of improving human genetics through selective breeding. He advocated for forced sterilization of people he deemed unfit, including the poor, disabled, and mentally ill. His sanitarium promoted strict diets, hence the bland cornflakes, and eugenics-based health practices. While Kellogg's company distanced itself from his more extreme views after his death, the cereal empire was built on the fortune of a man who thought some people shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. Enjoy your frosted flakes. John Harvey Kellogg was born in 1852 and became one of the most prominent health reformers of his era. He ran the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, a health resort that attracted wealthy clients seeking treatments for everything from digestive issues to moral failings. Kellogg believed that diet, exercise, and clean living could cure almost any ailment, and he developed a range of bizarre treatments to prove it. Patients at his sanitarium underwent yogurt enemas, electric shock therapy, and rigid dietary regimens designed to suppress sexual desire and promote purity. Kellogg's obsession with purity extended beyond diet. He was a vocal advocate of the eugenics movement, which sought to improve the human race by encouraging reproduction among the fit and preventing reproduction among the unfit. Kellogg believed that poor health, poverty, and moral degeneracy were hereditary, passed down through bad bloodlines. He argued that society had a duty to sterilize people with disabilities, mental illness, or low intelligence to prevent them from passing on their defective genes. He wasn't alone in these beliefs. Eugenics was widely accepted in early 20th century America, supported by prominent scientists, politicians, and philanthropists. Forced sterilization laws were enacted in dozens of states, and tens of thousands of Americans were sterilized against their will, often without their knowledge or consent. Kellogg was one of the movement's most enthusiastic supporters, founding the Race Betterment Foundation in 1911 to promote eugenics education and research. The foundation held conferences, published pamphlets, and advocated for laws that would restrict immigration, ban interracial marriage, and mandate sterilization of the unfit. Kellogg's Sanitarium became a hub for eugenics advocates, hosting lectures and workshops on racial purity and genetic health. He believed that through careful breeding and strict dietary control, humanity could evolve into a superior race, free from disease, vice, and degeneracy. Kellogg's invention of cornflakes was tied to his broader health philosophy. He believed that bland, unseasoned food would suppress sexual urges and promote moral purity. Cornflakes were originally developed as a health food for sanitarium patients, designed to be so boring that they wouldn't stimulate the senses or provoke sinful thoughts. The cereal was marketed as wholesome, pure, and morally uplifting, a breakfast that would make you healthier and better. But Kellogg's brother, Will Keith Kellogg, saw a different opportunity. He wanted to mass-produce the cereal, add sugar to make it more palatable, and sell it to the general public. The brothers feuded bitterly over this, with John Harvey Kellogg insisting that adding sugar would corrupt the product's purity. Will ignored him, founded the Kellogg Company in 1906 and turned cornflakes into a commercial success. The cereal became a household staple, and the Kellogg brand grew into one of the largest food companies in the world. John Harvey Kellogg's eugenics advocacy continued for decades, even as the movement's reputation began to sour. By the 1930s, eugenics had become associated with Nazi racial policies, and many Americans distanced themselves from the movement. But Kellogg didn't back down. He continued promoting eugenics until his death in 1943, arguing that genetic improvement was essential for the survival of civilization. The Kellogg Company, meanwhile, quietly distanced itself from John Harvey Kellogg's more extreme views. The company emphasized wholesome family values, nutrition, and Americana in its advertising, avoiding any mention of eugenics or racial purity. By the time Kellogg's Frosted Flakes, Rice Krispies, and Pop-Tarts became cultural icons, the founders' eugenics crusade was a forgotten footnote. But the history is still there. John Harvey Kellogg built his fortune on a philosophy that viewed human beings as breeding stock, that advocated for the sterilization of the vulnerable, and that promoted racial and genetic hierarchies. The cereal you eat for breakfast was invented by a man who believed some people didn't deserve to exist. The Kellogg Company has never apologized for its founder's beliefs, never addressed his role in the eugenics movement, and never reckoned with the fact that its empire was built on a deeply dehumanizing ideology. Today, Kellogg's is one of the most recognizable brands in the world, selling billions of dollars worth of cereal, snacks, and convenience foods annually. The company markets itself as wholesome, family-friendly, and nutritious. But the legacy of John Harvey Kellogg, eugenicist, extremist, and architect of a movement that sterilized tens of thousands of Americans, remains buried beneath the cheerful cartoon mascots and colorful packaging. Enjoy your cornflakes. Just try not to think about where they came from. Johnson & Johnson has spent over a century marketing baby powder as safe and gentle. But by the 1940s, the company knew that some batches of talcum powder were contaminated with asbestos, a known carcinogen. They didn't recall the product. They didn't warn consumers. They kept selling it, even as internal memos showed concerns about safety. Decades later, lawsuits revealed that Johnson & Johnson had hidden the risks for generations. Thousands of people developed cancer. The company paid billions in settlements, but never admitted wrongdoing. Trust is a brand, but so is denial. Talcum powder, made from talc, a soft mineral mined from the earth, has been a staple of American bathrooms since the late 19th century. Johnson & Johnson's baby powder became iconic, marketed as pure, gentle, and safe enough for the most delicate skin. Mothers dusted it on their babies after baths. Women used it for personal hygiene. The powder was everywhere, trusted implicitly, wrapped in the company's carefully cultivated image of maternal care and scientific reliability. But there was a problem that Johnson & Johnson knew about and chose to ignore. Talc deposits are often found near asbestos deposits in the earth. When talc is mined, it can become contaminated with asbestos fibers, microscopic particles that, when inhaled or absorbed through skin, can cause deadly cancers like mesothelioma and ovarian cancer. The risk was known within the industry as early as the 1930s. Studies show that cosmetic-grade talc could contain asbestos. Johnson & Johnson's own scientists raised concerns in internal memos and reports. But the company didn't stop production. They didn't reformulate the product. They didn't warn consumers. Instead, Johnson & Johnson implemented a strategy of selective testing and careful messaging. When tests showed asbestos contamination, the results were often dismissed as anomalies or attributed to testing errors. When independent labs found asbestos in their products, Johnson & Johnson challenged the methodology, questioned the findings, and kept selling. The company's internal documents, revealed decades later in court cases, show a disturbing pattern. Executives knew about the contamination risk, debated how to handle it, and ultimately decided that the financial cost of a recall or reformulation outweighed the health risks to consumers. By the 1970s and 80s, evidence linking talcum powder to ovarian cancer was mounting. Studies suggested that women who regularly used talcum powder for feminine hygiene had a significantly higher risk of developing ovarian cancer. The mechanism wasn't fully understood, but the correlation was clear. Researchers presented their findings at medical conferences, published in journals, and called for further investigation. Johnson & Johnson responded with a public relations campaign designed to discredit the research, funding studies that showed no link and emphasizing the product's long history of safe use. The company also fought back in the courts. When women diagnosed with ovarian cancer began suing Johnson & Johnson, claiming that decades of baby powder use had caused their disease, the company hired powerful law firms and expert witnesses to defend itself. The legal strategy was to deny, delay, and outlast the plaintiffs. Many of the women suing were elderly, sick, and dying. Johnson & Johnson counted on them not living long enough to see their cases through. It was a brutal calculation, and it often worked. But in the 2000s and 2010s, the tide began to turn. Investigative journalists obtained internal Johnson & Johnson documents through court discovery, and what they found was damning. Memos from the 1970s showed that company executives had discussed the asbestos problem and decided against warning consumers or changing the product. Tests from the 1980s and 90s showed repeated asbestos contamination, yet the product remained on shelves. Johnson & Johnson had known for decades that their baby powder might be killing people, and they had chosen profit over safety. Juries began awarding massive verdicts to plaintiffs. In 2018, a Missouri jury awarded 22 women nearly $4.7 billion in damages, finding that Johnson & Johnson had knowingly sold contaminated talcum powder and failed to warn consumers. Other verdicts followed, and the company faced thousands of additional lawsuits. The legal and financial pressure mounted, and in 2020, Johnson & Johnson announced it would stop selling talc-based baby powder in the United States and Canada, citing misinformation and declining sales. The company insisted the product was safe, but claimed that defending it in court was no longer financially viable. The move was widely seen as an admission of guilt disguised as a business decision. Johnson & Johnson never formally acknowledged that its baby powder caused cancer. It never issued a public apology to the thousands of women who used the product and later developed ovarian cancer. Instead, the company shifted to a cornstarch-based formula, rebranded, and moved on, hoping that time and distance would bury the scandal. But the lawsuits continue. Victims and their families are still seeking justice, still fighting for accountability, and the evidence keeps emerging, showing that Johnson & Johnson knew, covered up, and prioritized profits over the health of the people who trusted them most. The baby powder that was supposed to protect became a source of disease and death, and the company that sold it with a smile is still standing, still trusted, still selling products to families around the world. The powder is gone from American shelves, but the cancer remains, and so does the corporation that caused it. Procter Gamble, the maker of Tide, Crest and Pampers, operated factories in Nazi Germany during World War II. Like many American companies, they used forced labour from concentration camps and prisoners of war to keep production running. After the war, P&G quietly resumed operations and never publicly addressed their use of slave labour. Today, they're one of the most trusted consumer goods companies in the world. Their Nazi era past, not mentioned in the annual report. Procter & Gamble was founded in 1837 in Cincinnati, Ohio, and by the early 20th century, it had become one of America's largest consumer goods manufacturers. The company produced soap, candles, cooking oil, and a range of household products that became staples in American homes. P&G expanded internationally in the 1920s and 30s, opening factories and distribution networks across Europe. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, P&G didn't pull out. They stayed, adapted, and continued producing soap and other products for the German market. During World War II, P&G's German operations faced the same labour shortages as every other industrial company in the Reich. Millions of German men were drafted into the military, leaving factories understaffed and struggling to meet production demands. The Nazi solution was forced labour. Prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and conscripted workers from occupied territories were distributed to factories across Germany. P&G's factories received their share. These workers were not employees in any meaningful sense. They were slaves. They received no wages, no benefits, and no choice. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions with minimal food and brutal discipline. Those who couldn't keep up were beaten, sent back to camps, or simply worked to death. P&G's German managers oversaw these operations, coordinating with Nazi authorities to receive workers and ensure production continued. The company's American executives, meanwhile, claimed they had no control over their German subsidiary once the war started. It was the same defense used by Ford, GM, and IBM. We lost contact, we couldn't intervene, it wasn't our responsibility. But records suggest otherwise. P&G maintained financial ties to its German operations throughout the war, routing profits through subsidiaries in neutral countries. The company's leadership knew what was happening in Germany, they received reports, they monitored assets, and they planned for the post-war period when they could reclaim full control. They chose to stay silent, to let the forced labour continue, and to profit from it indirectly. After the war, Allied investigators documented the use of forced labour in German factories, including those operated by American companies. But prosecutions were rare, and corporate accountability was almost non-existent. P&G, like most other companies, was allowed to resume operations in Germany without facing serious consequences. The forced labourers were liberated, but they received no compensation from P&G. The company didn't apologise, didn't acknowledge their suffering, and didn't pay reparations. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the issue of forced labour during World War II resurfaced on a large scale. Survivors and their families filed class action lawsuits against American and German companies, demanding compensation for the years of unpaid labour and abuse they had endured. The lawsuits drew international attention, and in 2000 the German government and a coalition of companies, including P&G, agreed to establish a compensation fund for former forced labourers. P&G contributed to the fund, though the company never disclosed the exact amount. The payments to individual survivors were modest, usually a few $1,000s each, and many former workers received nothing because they had died, couldn't prove their employment, or fell outside the narrow eligibility criteria. P&G issued a brief statement acknowledging that forced labour had been used in its German factories and expressing regret, but the company stopped short of a formal apology or a full accounting of its wartime activities. Today, Procter & Gamble is one of the largest and most successful consumer goods companies in the world, with a portfolio of brands that includes Tide, Crest, Pampers, Gillette, and dozens of others. The company's annual revenue exceeds $80 billion, and its products are sold in more than 180 countries. P&G markets itself as a responsible corporate citizen, emphasizing sustainability, diversity, and social responsibility. The company's Nazi-era use of forced labor is rarely mentioned in corporate materials, press releases, or advertising campaigns. When asked about its wartime history, P&G points to its participation in the compensation fund and notes that the events occurred more than 70 years ago, under circumstances beyond the company's control. But that narrative erases the choices P&G made, the choice to stay in Nazi Germany, the choice to use forced labor, and the choice to remain silent for decades while survivors fought for justice. The soap you use to wash your dishes, the toothpaste you brush your teeth with, the diapers you put on your baby, they're all brought to you by a company that once relied on slave labor to keep its factories running. P&G didn't invent forced labor, and they weren't the only company to benefit from it. But they participated, they profited, and they've never fully accounted for it. The products are clean. The history is not. Bayer's aspirin was everywhere in the 1940s, sold as a safe, reliable painkiller. But Bayer was also developing experimental drugs that were tested on concentration camp prisoners without consent. The line between legitimate medicine and human experimentation was blurred, and Bayer executives saw no problem crossing it. After the war, Bayer rebranded, apologized vaguely, and continued selling aspirin as if nothing had happened. Take 2 and call your lawyer in the morning. Aspirin, or acetylsalicylic acid, was first synthesized by Bayer chemist Felix Hoffmann in 1897. It became one of the most successful pharmaceutical products in history, marketed as a safe and effective treatment for pain, fever, and inflammation. By the 1940s, aspirin was a household name, trusted by millions of people around the world. Bayer's reputation as a pharmaceutical innovator was built on aspirin's success. But behind the wholesome image of healing and relief, Bayer was engaged in activities that were anything but benign. As a subsidiary of IG Farben, the massive German chemical conglomerate, Bayer was deeply integrated into the Nazi war effort. IG Farben produced everything from synthetic rubber and fuel to Zyklon B, the poison gas used in concentration camp gas chambers. Bayer's role within the conglomerate included pharmaceutical research and production, and during the war that research took a dark turn. Bayer scientists conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners, testing new drugs, anesthetics, and treatments under conditions that violated every ethical principle of medicine. The experiments were conducted primarily at Auschwitz, where Bayer had a close working relationship with SS doctors, including Josef Mengele. Prisoners were used as test subjects for experimental painkillers, antibiotics, and vaccines. They were infected with diseases and then given untested drugs to see if the treatments worked. They were subjected to surgeries without anesthesia to test the effectiveness of new pain management techniques. The suffering was immense, and the mortality rate was staggering. Bayer scientists documented the results in detailed reports, noting dosages, side effects, and outcomes. The reports were clinical, detached, and utterly devoid of humanity. Bayer didn't just passively receive data from SS doctors. The company actively requested prisoners for experiments, negotiating with camp administrators and paying fees for access to human test subjects. Invoices and correspondence show that Bayer treated prisoners as commodities, ordering them in batches like laboratory animals. When one group of prisoners died or became too sick to continue, Bayer simply ordered more. After the war, Allied investigators uncovered evidence of Bayer's role in the experiments. Several Bayer executives and scientists were prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials as part of the IG Farben case. The prosecution presented damning evidence: letters requesting prisoners, invoices for payment, and reports documenting experiments that resulted in death and suffering. Some defendants were convicted and sentenced to prison, but the sentences were light. Most served less than 5 years, and many were released early and returned to positions in the pharmaceutical industry. Bayer itself was not dismantled. IG Farben was broken up into smaller companies after the war, and Bayer re-emerged as an independent entity in 1951. The company resumed production of aspirin and other pharmaceuticals, marketing itself as a trusted name in medicine. The concentration camp experiments were buried, mentioned only in historical studies and legal proceedings. Bayer's public image was carefully managed. The company emphasized its contributions to healthcare, its commitment to innovation, and its role in improving lives. The dark chapter of human experimentation was quietly ignored. Compensation for victims came slowly and reluctantly. In the 1990s, as public awareness of corporate complicity in the Holocaust grew, Bayer faced pressure to acknowledge its past and compensate survivors. The company contributed to compensation funds and issued statements expressing regret, but it stopped short of a full apology or a comprehensive accounting of its wartime activities. Bayer emphasized that the experiments were conducted by individual scientists, not the corporation as a whole, and that the company had been taken over by the Nazi regime, but the evidence tells a different story. Bayer executives knew about the experiments. They approved them, funded them, and profited from the data collected. The experiments were not rogue operations. They were part of Bayer's pharmaceutical research program, integrated into the company's broader efforts to develop new drugs and treatments. The prisoners were not volunteers. They were victims, exploited and discarded in the name of scientific progress. Today, Bayer is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, producing everything from aspirin and vitamins to advanced cancer treatments and prescription medications. The company emphasizes its commitment to ethical research, patient safety, and social responsibility. It sponsors medical conferences, funds research initiatives, and markets itself as a leader in healthcare innovation. But the history is still there, documented in archives, court transcripts, and the testimony of survivors. Bayer didn't just make aspirin in the 1940s. They made choices to experiment on human beings, choices to prioritize data over dignity, choices to participate in genocide. The aspirin still works, the company still thrives, but the experiments and the people who suffered through them have never been forgotten. Not completely. Singer, the sewing machine company, pivoted during World War II to produce military equipment, including bomb sights and gun parts. They made a fortune supplying both the Allies and, through subsidiaries, the Axis powers. After the war, Singer went back to making sewing machines and marketed themselves as wholesome and domestic. The weapons, forgotten. The profits, invested. Singer Sewing Machine Company was founded in 1851 and became one of the first true multinational corporations, with factories and sales offices across the globe. By the early 20th century, Singer sewing machines were in millions of homes, symbols of modernity, domesticity, and self-sufficiency. The company's marketing emphasized family values, home-based productivity, and the empowerment of women through access to tools that allowed them to create and mend clothing. But when World War II broke out, Singer, like many manufacturing companies, shifted production to support the war effort. The company's factories in the United States began producing military equipment, including bomb sights, gun parts, and other precision instruments used in aircraft and artillery. Singer's expertise in precision manufacturing, honed through decades of producing sewing machines, translated well to military applications. The company received lucrative government contracts and became a major supplier to the US military. Singer's international subsidiaries, however, operated in a more complicated landscape. The company had factories in Germany, France, and other European countries, many of which fell under Nazi occupation during the war. Singer's German subsidiary continued operating under Nazi control, producing goods for the German military and using forced labour to meet production demands. Prisoners of war and conscripted workers were employed in Singer factories, working under brutal conditions with no pay and no rights. Singer's American executives claimed they had lost control of their European operations once the war started, a familiar refrain used by companies like Ford and GM. But records show that Singer maintained financial ties to its subsidiaries through neutral intermediaries and planned for the post-war period when they could reclaim full control. The company's leadership knew what was happening in occupied Europe, and they chose not to intervene, prioritizing the preservation of corporate assets over ethical concerns. After the war, Singer quickly pivoted back to civilian production. The company's factories retooled, switching from bomb sites back to sewing machines. Singer launched advertising campaigns emphasizing home, family, and the return to normalcy. The company marketed itself as part of the post-war rebuilding effort, helping families stitch their lives back together, literally. The wartime production of weapons was barely mentioned in corporate materials or advertising. It was treated as a temporary necessity, a patriotic duty fulfilled, and then quietly set aside. Singer's use of forced labour in its European factories was even more thoroughly buried. The company never publicly acknowledged it, never apologised to the workers who had been exploited, and never paid reparations. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when lawsuits and historical investigations brought corporate complicity and forced labour to public attention, that Singer's wartime activities were scrutinised. By then, Singer was a shadow of its former self, having struggled financially for decades and eventually sold off to other companies. The brand still exists, but the original Singer Corporation is long gone. Singer's story illustrates how easily companies could pivot between war and peace, weapons and domesticity, without accountability. The same precision that created a sewing machine that could stitch fabric also created bomb sites that could target cities. The same factories that employed women to operate sewing machines employed slaves to produce instruments of death. And the same company that marketed itself as wholesome and family-friendly made a fortune arming both sides of the largest conflict in human history. Today, Singer sewing machines are still sold, though the brand has changed hands multiple times and is now manufactured by different companies in different countries. The sewing machines are marketed with the same emphasis on domesticity and creativity that defined the brand in its heyday. But the wartime chapter, the weapons production, the forced labour, the profits made from both the Allies and the Axis, has been largely forgotten. Singer's corporate history emphasises innovation, empowerment and tradition, and complicity and opportunism. But the history is still there, buried in archives and court documents. Singer didn't just make sewing machines during the 1940s. They made weapons, they used slave labour, and they profited from the war on multiple fronts. The company moved seamlessly from war to peace, from weapons to domesticity, without ever acknowledging the contradictions or the human cost. The sewing machines still stitch. The weapons are long gone, but the profits from both remain, woven into the fabric of a brand that wants you to remember only the wholesome parts of its past. General Electric didn't just make light bulbs, they controlled the global light bulb market through a cartel that included Nazi-era Osram. The cartel fixed prices, limited production, and ensured that light bulbs burned out quickly to keep customers buying more. During the war, GE's German partners used forced labor in their factories. After the war, GE claimed they had no control over their international partners. But the patents, the profits, and the corporate structure told a different story. The light bulb cartel was eventually broken up, but GE walked away richer than ever. The story begins in 1924, when General Electric, along with European companies like Philips and Osram, formed the Phoebus cartel. The official name was the Phoebus et Compagnie Industrielle pour le Développement de l'Éclairage, but its purpose was simple: control the global light bulb market. The cartel members agreed to fix prices, divide markets, and most deviously, limit the lifespan of light bulbs. This practice, known as planned obsolescence, ensured that consumers would need to buy new bulbs frequently, generating consistent profits for the cartel members. Before the cartel, light bulbs were being engineered to last longer and longer. Some bulbs could burn for 2,500 hours or more, but the Phoebus cartel established a standard, 1,000 hours, any bulb, that lasted significantly longer was seen as a problem cutting into future sales. The cartel enforced this standard through a system of testing and fines. Member companies submitted their bulbs for testing, and if they lasted too long, the company was fined. It was a brilliantly cynical system that prioritized profit over innovation or consumer benefit. General Electric was the dominant force in the cartel, holding the most patents and wielding the most influence. GE controlled the American market and had significant stakes in European operations, including Osram, the German light bulb manufacturer. When the Nazis came to power, Osram became deeply integrated into the German war economy, producing not just light bulbs but also specialized lighting for military equipment, aircraft and submarines. Osram factories used forced labor from concentration camps and occupied territories, exploiting workers to meet production demands. GE's relationship with Osram continued throughout the 1930s and into the war. The company shared patents, coordinated production, and maintained financial ties through subsidiaries in neutral countries. GE executives received reports on Osram's operations and knew about the use of forced labor. But like other American companies with German partnerships, GE claimed that once the war started they lost control and couldn't influence what happened in Europe. It was a convenient fiction that protected the company from accountability. The Phoebus cartel operated until the outbreak of World War II, when international cooperation became impossible and the cartel's structure collapsed. But the damage was done. For more than 15 years, the cartel had artificially limited the lifespan of light bulbs, costing consumers billions of dollars and stifling innovation. The 1,000-hour standard became so ingrained in the industry that even after the cartel dissolved, manufacturers continued producing bulbs with limited lifespans. Planned obsolescence became a business model, not just for light bulbs but for a wide range of consumer products. After the war, Allied investigators uncovered evidence of the cartel and its activities. GE and other members were accused of antitrust violations, price fixing, and restraint of trade. In the United States, GE faced legal action and was forced to license some of its patents to competitors. In Europe, Osram and other companies were scrutinized for their use of forced labor, but prosecutions were minimal and consequences were light. GE emerged from the war as one of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world, its reputation barely dented by the cartel scandal. GE's post-war strategy was to emphasize innovation, American ingenuity, and corporate responsibility. The company launched advertising campaigns celebrating its contributions to modern life, from light bulbs and appliances to jet engines and power plants. The Phoebus cartel was mentioned, if at all, as a historical footnote, a relic of a different era. The use of forced labour by GE's German partners was buried even deeper, rarely acknowledged and never fully accounted for. Today, General Electric is a massive conglomerate with operations in energy, aviation, healthcare, and finance. The company's light bulb division has been sold off, but GE's legacy in the industry remains. The practice of planned obsolescence, pioneered by the Phoebus cartel, has become standard across industries, from electronics to appliances. Products are designed to fail, to wear out, to become obsolete, ensuring that consumers keep buying. The light bulb cartel was one of the earliest and most successful examples of corporate collusion to limit competition and maximize profit at the expense of consumers. GE didn't just participate, they led it. They rigged the market, shared technology with Nazi-era companies, and profited from forced labor. And when the war ended, they walked away, richer and more powerful than ever. The light bulbs still burn out right on schedule, the profits still flow, and GE's role in creating a system designed to keep you buying over and over again has been quietly forgotten. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, maybe take a second to think about the 1940s. Not the heroic version you learned in school, not the greatest generation narrative, but the version where American corporations made calculated choices, where they weighed profits against principles and chose profits every time, where they collaborated with fascism, used slave labor, and then walked away richer, more powerful, and almost completely unpunished. The companies that armed the Wehrmacht are still making cars. The banks that froze Jewish accounts are still managing money. The chemical companies that tested drugs on concentration camp prisoners are still selling medicine. The soda company that invented Fanta for Nazi Germany is still the symbol of American refreshment. They didn't just survive their collaboration with evil, they thrived because of it. The profits from the 1940s funded their post-war expansion, their technological innovations, their global dominance. The wealth generated from slave labor, from stolen Jewish assets, from weapons sold to both sides, was reinvested, compounded, and passed down through generations of shareholders. And America let it happen. We were so eager to move on, so ready to embrace the post-war boom and the promise of prosperity that we didn't ask the hard questions. We didn't demand accountability. We didn't prosecute executives or dismantle corporations. We handed out small fines, accepted vague apologies, and went shopping. Because it was easier to forgive than to confront. Easier to buy a new Ford than to remember that Ford built trucks for the Nazis. Easier to drink a Coke than to think about Fanta's origins. Easier to trust Bayer aspirin than to acknowledge the concentration camp. Experiments. The corporations understood this. They knew that time, advertising, and our collective desire for normalcy would erase the inconvenient parts of their histories. And they were right. Within a generation, the 1940s were remembered only for their heroism and sacrifice, not for the corporate complicity that made genocide more efficient and war more profitable. The brands that had wrapped themselves in swastikas rebranded themselves in American flags. The factories that used slave labor became symbols of industrial innovation. The executives who collaborated with fascism became captains of post-war capitalism. But the secrets never fully disappeared. They've been buried, yes, hidden in archives, sealed in court settlements, scrubbed from corporate websites, but they're still there, waiting for anyone curious enough or angry enough to dig them up. Researchers have uncovered them, journalists have reported them, survivors have testified about them. The information exists. It's just not part of the story these companies want to tell. Because acknowledging the past would mean confronting uncomfortable truths about how wealth is built, how power is maintained, and how easily society forgives corporations that it would never forgive individuals for. And maybe that's the real lesson of the 1940s. Not that corporations are evil, most aren't. They're just pragmatic to the point of amorality. The lesson is that when profit and principle collide, profit almost always wins. That corporations will collaborate with anyone, sell to anyone, and exploit anyone if the numbers make sense. That accountability is optional when you're powerful enough. That history can be rewritten if you have enough money for advertising. That the public's memory is short, forgiving, and easily manipulated. The brands you trust today are the same brands that made those choices 80 years ago. They're older now, more sophisticated, more globally dominant, but the logic hasn't changed. Profit still comes first, and when the next crisis arrives, when the next moral choice presents itself, there's no reason to believe they'll choose differently, because they've learned the most important lesson, that you can do almost anything, wait a few decades, rebrand, and people will forget, or they'll never know in the first place. So here you are, lying in bed, probably thinking you'll never look at a Fanta the same way again. Maybe you won't, or maybe tomorrow you'll go to the store, see that bright orange bottle, and buy it anyway. Not because you've forgiven Coca-Cola for inventing it for Nazis, but because the past feels distant and the present feels immediate. Because it's just a soda. Because everyone else is drinking it. Because the brand has spent 70 years and billions of dollars making sure you associate it with fun, not fascism. And that's fine. Really. You don't have to boycott every brand with a dark past. You'd have almost nothing left to buy. You don't have to carry the weight of history every time you brush your teeth or fill up your gas tank. But maybe, just maybe, you can carry the knowledge. You can know that the companies you trust have histories they'd prefer you never learned. You can know that the products you use were sometimes built on suffering. You can know that the 1940s weren't just about American heroism. They were also about American corporations making deals with devils and walking away unpunished. Because knowing is different from forgetting, and remembering is different from forgiving. The companies that collaborated with Nazi Germany hoped you'd forget. They spent decades making sure you would, but now you know. You know about IBM's punch cards organizing the Holocaust. You know about Ford's Nazi medal and Wehrmacht trucks. You know about Bayer's concentration camp experiments. You know about Coca-Cola's Fanta and Chase Bank's frozen Jewish accounts. You know about the slave labor, the profiteering, the silence, and the rebranding. You know the secrets they hoped would stay buried. What you do with that knowledge is entirely up to you. You can be angry, you can demand better, you can make different choices, or you can acknowledge it, file it away, and move on with your life. But you can't unknow it. The 1940s happened. American corporations collaborated with Nazis. They profited from genocide, and they got away with it. That's not speculation or conspiracy theory. It's documented history, proven in court cases, confirmed by the companies themselves, even if reluctantly and decades too late. So as you close your eyes tonight, maybe whisper a quiet acknowledgement to the people who suffered, the forced labourers who built the cars you drive, the concentration camp prisoners who tested the drugs you take, the Jewish families whose stolen wealth funded the banks you trust. Their suffering was real, their exploitation was profitable, and their stories have been erased from the brands that benefited from their pain. History isn't just what we choose to remember, it's also what we choose to forget. And American corporations in the 1940s did things they desperately hope you've forgotten. Things that were profitable then, and remain profitable now. Because the wealth didn't disappear, it just got laundered through time, rebranded through advertising, and normalized through our daily choices. The brands are still here, the secrets are still buried. But you know now, and that knowledge, uncomfortable as it is a kind of power. The power to see through the advertising, the power to question the narratives, the power to remember what they hoped you'd forget. Sweet dreams. And maybe, just maybe, when you wake up tomorrow, you'll see the brands around you a little differently. not as friendly logos and familiar products, but as companies with histories, with choices, with secrets. Companies that once made deals with fascism and walked away richer for it. The 1940s are over, but their legacy is still here, in every aisle of every store, in every product you trust, in every brand that hopes you'll never ask where it came from or what it took to get here. Sleep well. History is watching, and so, now, are you.